Morning. All for being here. Happy to try. Welcome to the World Affairs Council of Atlanta's EU Day Symposium. My name is Rickey Bevington. I am president of the council. I haven't met all of you, but I look forward to meeting all of you over the course of this half-day symposium. We have been very pleased by the interest from the community in this event. Sometimes you put a shingle out into the world and you say, we are offering something, you don't know the response. I am very encouraged, and I know my colleagues are, by the interest by Atlantans in these issues that we're going to be talking today. So thank you for being here. If you are not familiar with the World Affairs Council of Atlanta, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit civic organization. We are dedicated to amplifying informed thought leadership that prompts new thinking on critical global issues. And we do this by curating in-person and online opportunities for individuals to explore and discuss critical global issues. Throughout the year, we feature diplomats, dignitaries, executives, and subject matter experts providing world-class analysis on issues ranging from geopolitics and foreign policy to trade and the economy to armed conflict to humanitarian issues. We provide independent, nonpartisan, continuing education and networking for all Atlantans. We normally do our thank yous at the end, but our team has worked so hard to make today possible, and I don't even know if any of them are in the room. But I'm going to ask us all to recognize and applaud those who have made today possible. Nurin Khan, Dana Boga, Shelley Nelson, Samson Adodi, Lindsay Kane, Mohammed Umair, Nancy Aggie, and Nana Amoa. Please join me in giving them a round. Saying thank you for the thank you. Some housekeeping to the statements made today are those of the speaker and not of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. This program is on the record. It's also being recorded and live streamed via Zoom. And now for an introduction of our first panel's topic, Powering Europe's Future Policies, Public Attitudes, and Challenges. In this discussion, we explore Europe's shifting energy landscape. Although Europe shares an energy grid, member states' policies and public attitudes differ widely on topics such as renewables, nuclear, cooperation with Russia and the United States, the list goes on. Energy prices are falling overall, and France, Germany, and Italy recently broke records for solar production, but a looming trade war with the US could disrupt Europe's energy mix. Our distinguished speakers today are Edward Chow and Adam Stolberg. Ed is an international energy expert with 40 years of industry experience and a senior associate in the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He has developed government policy and business strategy in Asia, the Middle East, Africa, South America, Europe, Russia, Black Sea, and Caspian regions. Chow spent 20 years with Chevron Corporation in headquarter and overseas assignments, including head of international external relations and country manager in China. He currently teaches at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Welcome, Edward Chow.
We wanted Adam to go first.
We're going to invite both.
You just want us to sit down.
We didn't do our blocking. So thank you for joining us. And Adam, who will be the first speaker, is the Sam Nunn Chair, the Sam Nunn School Chair and Professor in the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology, Georgia Tech, here in Atlanta. He teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on international security, Russia-Eurasian politics and security affairs, nuclear non-proliferation, and energy and international security, as well as interdisciplinary courses on science, technology, and international security policy. His current research focuses on the geopolitics of oil and gas networks, energy security dilemmas, and statecraft in Eurasia, Russia, and gray zone conflicts, new approaches to strategic stability, internationalization of the nuclear fuel cycle, and implications of emerging technologies for strategic stability and international security. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Adam Stolberg. So Adam is going to open with some slides and a presentation. Do you want to do that here or here? Okay, great. I will let you take over.
Thank you, Ricky, and thank you, the World Affairs Council. It's nice to see so many familiar faces actually out there, to see some students even. As Ricky mentioned, I've been asked to sort of come up and maybe set the scene for our discussion today about this European energy landscape amid changing geopolitical context. And let me just apologize. First, I'm an educator by profession, so I can't speak without a crutch these days, which are the PowerPoints, but I don't mean to give too many of these, but I think it's important that we understand the broader context of the European and member state decisions on energy security to enrich our discussion. And so I think the first thing to really appreciate is that the fundamental challenge confronting the EU and the member states as to how it relates to balancing the three legs of an energy trilemma, right? Sort of balancing between sustainability, equity and affordability, and then security, i.e. geopolitical challenges. And for those of you who are not steeped in the energy space, there are different ways that governments can intervene to help manage that process, right? By through their regulatory processes, the institutional constructs of the different entities, governing mechanisms. They can do it through investments. They can do it through education, training the workforce, through the infrastructure development projects, and also through innovation, right? So there are a number of ways that governments can intervene to affect the balance. And EU is currently has set out a set of goals with respect to where that balance should be between energy security, affordability, and sustainability. And they've leaned heavily in terms of their objectives, the EU objectives, on decarbonization, on reducing consumption, especially in the fossil fuels sector, and stimulating renewables, especially with respect to hydrogen, bioenergy, and synthetic fuels, and really relying heavily on the electrification process, where they see green hydrogen playing a role. But the one thing that should stand out on this chart is there's a difference between where those 2050 objectives are and the current trajectories that the EU is on. So again, how they intervene to affect that gap between their current trajectory and their stated objectives is going to matter, right? And the how, when, why, and of course, if around those interventions are going to matter not only to the EU and the member states in fulfilling their objectives, but as you can see, this will have a global impact. So if we zoom in on natural gas on the right-hand side chart, you can see that the gap between the current trajectory and the net zero objectives are going to require a very big change in performance on reducing natural gas consumption by the developed. The EU plays an integral role. Any future scenario out to 2050 is going to require significant reductions on with natural gas. The future of LNG, which you're going to hear more about in our conversations, is also going to be affected by the EU as well as, of course, Asia, right? So the differences in the various LNG scenarios out there are going to be contingent upon decisions made by the EU. But of course, as many of you know, the EU operates at the all-union level, but of course the member states are really critical for the implementation of these objectives, and they have very different profiles. And you can see the differences in terms of the shares of renewables in their net electricity, but this just captures the difference and the variation between the member states. And those variations have to do with some basics and fundamentals related to energy, right? Different endowments and profiles, different weather conditions that affect the different member states, the balance between household and industrial consumption, and of course, the availability of alternatives confronting each one of these states is different. So there are variations among the member states that are going to matter tremendously in how we think about the implementation of the objectives and the interventions to balance among these three legs of the stool, if you will. So that's the EU picture. The other thing that I would just want to leave you before I step down is that there's a lot of discussion about Russia today. But I think the bottom line, especially when it comes to natural gas, which is really where they're fundamentally playing a role in Europe, is that they're down, certainly, but they're not out. Right? Globally, under both scenarios, they're going to be playing a big role in natural gas. But what's interesting and what's projected to change is their footprint in natural gas is going to be shifting more and more to the LNG side. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A, what that means. But the point that you should think about is Russia is down, certainly, and there's a ripe debate, and the EU is confronting it right now as to whether or not they're going to, cut off all imports from Russia. But Russia is still going to be a player in the global context, and that could affect prices, especially as LNG becomes more prominent. The other thing to keep in mind is that China, with its protectionist characteristics, is very much a part of the renewable conversation, especially with respect to Europe and with respect to installed low carbon manufacturing capacity and the ability to generate the technologies needed for those across the spectrum of renewables. So let me just stop right here with just the opening remark, but I think it's important for you to keep in mind that the fundamental challenge confronting the EU and its member states is how to contend with this energy trilemma using the various tools that they have, but managing differences across the member states in a context where their decisions have global impact on our global capacity to make a difference in terms of the energy, meeting our various energy, environmental and climate goals and sustainability goals. In a context also where Russia and China are major players. So let me just stop there.
If I stand up.
Of course.
Switch.
As all of you others, my flight from Washington was 4.5 hours late yesterday. And then I stayed up too late last night with a friend. And so I thought it'd be better if I stood up rather than sit in the chair to address you. But first of all, thank you, Rickey, and the World Affairs Council for this invitation to come to Atlanta. I don't come to Atlanta very often, but every time I come, I'm reminded of what an international city Atlanta is. I got to the airport. I was driven to my hotel by a cab driver from Nigeria. I checked into the hotel. The receptionist was a Filipina. I had dinner with an old friend from Hong Kong who has lived in Atlanta for 50 years. And then we went to a wonderful Greek seafood restaurant, and the server was Serbian. So it's really wonderful that you all are doing this EU Day Symposium, while a large part of our country seem to be turning inward. And so I really appreciate that what the World Affairs Council has organized here. I'm going to hit a few overarching themes that might help inform our discussion later. And just say a few things that I've learned in the 40-some years I've been in the oil and gas and energy industry. Some pretty basic stuff, but it affects the topic and the impact on Europe as it relates to energy. The first thing to say is that human progress has always been associated with more plentiful, cleaner, and more affordable energy. And that's always been true. And the latest example is AI and the surge in electricity demand from AI. So that principle, and part of Adam's triangle, now has this overlay of climate concerns, which you can think of as a form of cleaner energy, right? Environmentally sustainable energy. But it's not necessarily lead to, at least in the short term, of more affordable energy or more secure energy. And we saw that with COVID, where energy demand dropped as a result of economic downturn. But the governments were not happy with that because they like to be reelected and they like their citizens to be prosperous. So we stimulated the economy with fiscal and monetary policy to the point where our greenhouse gas emissions today are higher than they were before COVID. And so there's a tension that always exists between economics and other societal goals. We also saw that with the energy security issues related to Russia's war invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and I'll return to that in a minute. But I think that's the context that we have to think of as, and it impacts European climate policy at the same time. Europe would like to be a leader in climate policy globally. Whether anyone is following Europe or not is a different question, but Europe wants to be a leader. And this is very laudable, I would say. Partly for historical reasons. After all, the Industrial Revolution started in Europe. But I would remind you that European greenhouse gas emissions per capita today is still twice of that of India. For Americans, I will say that American greenhouse gas emissions per capita today is twice of that of China. So there is this additional layer of concern on energy that wasn't there before that Europe is trying to address. The security supply question obviously came to sharp relief after February 2022. But you really should have alarmed Europe long before that. In 2014, for example, with the annexation of Crimea and the Russian incursion into Donbass. But those of us in the energy security space like to say that there was an alarm and then Europe hit the snooze button, right? Because what did they do after that? They doubled down on Russian gas with the Nord Stream pipeline project, with the Turk Stream pipeline project going under, respectively, the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, to a point where by 2022, Russia represents 45% of European natural gas imports. So overdependence on one source of supply may not be the best thing to do. At the same time, Germany shut down the nuclear power plants. which honestly I never understood. It seemed to be a political reaction to Fukushima, but I never understood why they were worried about tsunamis in Bavaria. But anyway, so which is why Russian natural gas was supposed to be that bridge fuel between heavy greenhouse gas emission fuels and into a world that's completely or largely powered by renewables, right? So Russian gas was important for that reason. So so now there's a concern about diversity of supply, which I think is a lesson that Russia has learned. We'll talk about what role Russia may play in the European energy picture maybe later in discussion. So, I mean, another thing I want to point out is the nature of the energy industry that I wasted 45 years of my life in. It's a capital-intensive industry, long-term industry. Neither supply or demand are particularly price elastic in the short to medium term. You're kind of stuck with what you have. It takes a long time to make changes. It always takes longer than political leaders would like to see. Because political leaders like to promise their electorate instant solutions, right? Whether it is Green New Deal or drill baby drill, neither of one of those slogans, and they are political slogans, really work in the energy industry. I don't have to tell anybody in Georgia about cost overruns and long delays on big energy projects. You all know this very well. Economy of scale really matters. And this is where actually China has an advantage, because if you've got economy of scale in a growing market, you can do more things than if you don't have economy of scale in a stagnant market, which is kind of what Europe is. Europeans like to say that they are the biggest consuming market in the world. 500 million Europeans, the biggest market, but not so much in energy. There are still bottlenecks in energy in terms of integrating the markets. There are lots of surplus LNG import facilities in Spain. When the Russian gas supply cutoffs took place, you would like to be able to think that you can use that to wheel LNG into the rest of the European market, because the import capacity is already there. But France has always blocked gas pipeline connections with Spain. So if you want to send gas from Spain to Italy, you can't do it. So there are still national champions, local protectionism, and so the more you integrate the markets, the more options you should have. But then it comes to the question of European governance, right? Where citizens look at the national governments and their national parliaments to represent them. No one looks to Brussels in Europe, right? And Brussels is just a bunch of unelected bureaucrats, making directives that often are not followed. So doing something about European governance so that, for example, a qualified majority of states can get certain legislation through that cannot be vetoed by one or two countries. Those are the kind of structural things that Europe needs to address, not only for energy, but including energy. The last thing I would say is on the supply, this diversity of supply issue. Russian oil and gas coming to Europe made them because of geography. But Europe's actually quite well situated in terms of being around energy producing regions. European influence on North America, I'm sorry, on Northern Africa, which traditionally have been very strong, has been weakened over time. You know, Italians are not helping solve any issues in Libya. The French relationship with Algeria. Europe is pretty close to the Middle East and pretty close to West Africa. So they had a menu of energy import sources they could have relied on, but their ability to project that influence through hard and soft power has diminished over time. And no, what President Macron likes to say called strategic autonomy, just not there unless you build up, and I don't want to bleed into the next panel, but again, this also impacts energy as well. When the Brits and the French intervened in Libya, they ran out of munitions. I mean, you can't bomb, you don't have enough bombs for Libya. How are you going to take care of any of this? Where are the Europeans on Somali pirates in the Gulf of Aden, Houthis in the Red Sea? They don't have that capacity in a world where the United States is no longer taking leadership over the energy security question. The United States took the leadership on the energy security question for one simple reason. The US used to be the largest oil importing country in the world. It was in our interest, also in Japan's interest, Europe's interest, and so on. But it's a byproduct of our own interests. With energy abundance domestically, you can see, and this is not a part or particular to one administration, you can see the American interests in protecting energy security for the global commons has diminished over time. And what's Europe's response to that? And these are questions that obviously Europeans have to address, but just as an observer, I think those are factors that we need to keep in mind as we go into more detailed energy questions that Rickey and the rest of you are going to pose, I'm sure. Thank you.
Since you both brought up, well, many topics, let's start with, it's not an accident that we're doing two panels on European energy and European defense. As Ed just mentioned, they do bleed into one another. Do you see more cooperation on energy security between European governments and also from European, from Brussels since Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
So I would say, as a great academic, yes and no. I think initially, I think the EU should be lauded for the depthness in the quick response to the February 2022 situation. Now, of course, I agree with Ed that really since 2006, the signals have been very clear that Russia was interested in wielding its energy as an instrument of non-commercial influence, and so they certainly had a long runway, but they didn't use it as well as Ed mentioned. But in 2022, the EU quickly pivoted to reducing imports from Russia, the natural gas and oil, reducing consumption in a cold winter, and increasing their focus on their storage. So they made a tremendous pivot, and they were aided in that pivot by the market and the investments they had previously made in interconnectors, but also LNG in particular. And so they were able to ride that LNG opportunity through this process. So, and I think that has brought the community together because they weren't facing a stark choice in 2022 of turning off Russian gas and not having any alternatives. So they were able as a community, I think, to cooperate to make that transition. But now I think they have got used to that transition. And so to make the next step to shift from the current trajectory, as I mentioned, to their objective, the net zero objectives. This is where the differences play out because the LNG offers them a cheaper option. And as I showed you before, the energy profiles and not to mention the politics in those different countries vary. And so I think the EU, there was a lot of cooperation and it was, and even at the subnational level, you had a convergence between folks that are more ideological, completely repelled by what Russia was doing. You had populists and those that are worried about energy vulnerability, all on the same page in making that transition that I mentioned. But I see now, as they're confronted with the costs of continuing along that energy transition versus the availability of LNG at a lower, even although it's a higher price than the pipe gas was, it's still lower than this transition would cost. That's where I think the challenges are lying in here, breakup of that cooperation.
I would agree with Adam that Europe did a lot better after 2022 than any of us predicted that they would have. It turned out not to be kind of fatal, and partly it was luck. 2 warm winters, Asian LNG demand being down because of COVID, gave Europe some breathing room that they otherwise may not have had. I think there is a problem with LNG long term from a European standpoint, though, which is that if you have zero emission targets, what you can't do is sign long-term contracts. And new LNG projects, liquefied natural gas projects, require long-term contracts that the developer can take to the bank and get financing. So you're talking about signing agreements that are 20 years or longer. And Europe doesn't want to do that. So when the war broke out, the large war in 2022, Europe made a big show of visiting Azerbaijan, recall. The Commission President and President of the Council went to Azerbaijan, said, give us more gas, or Qatar or some other country. And if you're from a producer standpoint, they say, okay, well, sign a 20-year contract and we'll build the capacity. But they won't. They can't. And to be consistent with the zero emission goals. So then you're relying on projects that are backed by Asian LNG importers like China, who are also perfectly happy to make trading profits by selling LNG they don't need anymore, but contracted for to the Europeans and make a big trading profit. So I'm not sure that, LNG may be that bridge fuel, but it depends on the actions of so many other actors than Europe in itself. On the defense cooperation, I think so far we've seen quite a lot of rhetoric. The French and the Poles just signed an agreement this week, right? So it all kind of sounds good that they're going to be doing more. But I think the institutional question is there if US is not leading NATO anymore, right? So what is the institutional basis for having a European defense posture that includes looking at things related to energy? Is it the EU, or some other entity? You would like to include the Brits if you can, right? because they have capacity in both militarily as well as in foreign affairs. So I think we still need to see what the structure would look like, maybe minus the United States. And we don't see that.
I was in Europe last week, when the massive power outages were happening in Portugal and Spain. I hope none of you got caught in it. It sounded pretty scary and disruptive. You know, what have we learned since that about, European energy grid, but also, renewables?
I would say one thing we learned is that there is a limit to how much you can rely on intermittent power, like solar and wind, unless you make some other technological breakthroughs. I mean, interconnectors having a larger market to kind of even things out would help. But what we really need is a breakthrough in utility scale energy storage. And we don't have that. And
We don't have.
we don't have the technology to store energy that's generated from solar and wind, but don't need to be used yet. And then there's also a question, well, who pays for that, right? I mean, even in here, you know, in the United States, where, you know, we have a state like Texas has a lot of solar and wind, for example, but they need spare capacity with natural gas on the days where the wind's not blowing and it's cloudy, right? And who pays for that capacity? I mean, that's, ultimately, would the utilities pay, or the rate pay, or should the taxpayer pay? And these, and if you think about it in European terms, then you need to figure out something that works for everybody, and not just for a single country like Spain or Portugal. I mean, there are market integration issues and technological issues at the same time. High voltage transmission lines that transmits electricity efficiently over long distances. That's another technological.
I mean, I agree with everything that Ed's mentioned. I would just say first of all, I don't know that we have the full information on what actually transpired, and the costs, associated with all of that, but I would say that the lessons learned will depend on where you sit, right? And so the challenge here will be whether or not there's gonna be a fundamental lesson learned about this episode, or the different groups are gonna take away different lessons. So one lesson could be for those who are advocating the energy transition of quicker through, we need to build out bigger interconnectors because it'll be easier to manage a much larger grid to solve for these kinds of problems than having a bunch of small local ones. So that could be one. But if you're in France, you may learn, hey, this is all the reason we don't have these interconnectors. We need to rely on nuclear, and we're not going to invest in it. So I think the lessons, I think likely the lessons are going to be learned in a way that already reflects the positions of the different advocates on what that balance of the energy trilemma is going to be. But the other thing that I think could be a game changer would be once we get a real accounting, the costs of this outage, and then measure that relative to what the cost of the investments that Ed mentioned would be. And I think that could be the game changer in this, because that is the ultimate material, cost associated.
I think I'm surprised to hear, well, let's talk about the tension between Europeans' commitment to the energy transition to clean energy and energy security. You know, we titled this, we included public attitudes and opinions because we're really trying to understand how Europeans see this. How are governments communicating this tension? And of course, across the EU member states, Would you say that there is one country that stands out as communicating this effectively? Or is it it's sort of getting lost for the average ratepayer and voter?
Communicating the energy, the net zero goals. So I think it's not just one country, they're regions. If you look at the map, I mean, Northern Europe is quite bullish on the renewables. I showed you there. They made tremendous strides. But I think there's an Eurobarometer, public opinion polls that show, that are quite telling actually about right now. The number one threat affecting people over 15 years old, it was the international situation, right? The anxiety, the tensions in the international immigration, and prices, inflation, and immediate economic conditions. Then it goes to climate, energy, security, and broader economic security. So I think you're seeing some tension across, the macro level sentiments in Europe, where all three of the legs are actually being adjusted downward, as opposed to immigration and inflation issues. But then it varies among the different countries, with obviously Northern Europe really leading, and Central Europe broadly stated more on the economic competitiveness side of the energy transition equation.
I would say, as a general matter, European governments, I'm not sure why it is, but they have done a better job than we have in the United States in terms of communicating the climate challenge. You look at opinion polls, and it's interesting to me that particularly West Europeans, I would say, trust their governments when they tell them that certain things need to be done. There are two buts though. One is, if you're in Eastern Europe and you have a different energy portfolio to begin with, that you have to transition out of, more coal-based, so on, and you're less prosperous to begin with, that's a bigger hurdle. I mean, if you look at German retail energy consumers have been subsidizing industrial consumers on energy, which is kind of unheard of. I mean, it's usually the other way around, actually, because well, I don't want to get into the energy weeds here, but I think what has happened since is that European industry has felt disadvantaged, particularly compared to American industry on energy costs. You look at electricity costs between Europe and the United States. If you are a large industrial plant that consumes a lot of energy, you're in the cement industry, the glass industry, the petrochemical industry, you're closing facilities from Europe, bringing it to low energy cost places, including the United States. So I think that there is the idea of whether energy policy is really affordable or not, at least by the target dates set up by the EU and also the Paris Accords, I think is coming to sharper relief now than when we were all kind of felt more economically secure.
I have a lot of questions about the Trump administration's minerals deal with Ukraine, and I think hopefully speak for people in the audience who are also just wondering about what is it, what the mechanics are. We don't have to get into the geopolitics of it, but since we're having a panel here on energy, how meaningful is this deal?
Okay, sorry, you have,
Well, I'm wearing Ukrainian colors, you'll notice, and I've worked on Ukraine on and off since 2021 quite intensively. And I've written about this, the early agreements. And I've been quoted in the press on this latest so-called agreement. I think to the extent that there is the values is more likely to be symbolic. To the extent that it helps the Trump administration stay engaged in supporting Ukraine militarily and otherwise, that's a good thing. But mineral deals, you think an oil and gas project takes a long time. Wait until you get into a mining project. We're talking about investments that would, no, you'd be lucky to get payout in 8 to 10 years. Never mind make a profit. Is it, no, so did the industry not know about Ukraine's mineral potential all this time? Of course, we all knew. And it's always exaggerated. Remember the Trump administration during the first time talked about the $1 trillion worth of minerals in Afghanistan? Whatever happened to that? So yeah, so the question is from an investor point of view, what change that would encourage you more likely to invest in Ukraine today than before this framework agreement was signed? I mean, I look at practical things. Give me reasonably priced war insurance. Right? I mean, that's something I know what it's worth. And so, you know, we have the Development Finance Corporation of the United States as a party to this agreement. If they put some real meat behind the agreement, like political risk insurance or risk insurance, then I know what it is. But otherwise, you know, oil and gas companies looked at Ukraine multiple times. Just American companies, Marathon did, ExxonMobil did, Chevron did, non-American companies, Shell spent a lot of time working on Ukraine. You know, and what does this agreement change? I would say very little, but I'm happy that it was signed because better that it was signed than not signed and have the kind of terrible thing we had at the White House. So President Zelensky, but you know, how meaningful it is, I mean, well, I would like to see more details.
so I completely agree. I mean, this is ultimately an investment fund, so all the issues that Ed mentioned are going to define it, but I think it's important we don't know all the details, right? But we do know.
No one knows.
Right, exactly. But one of the reasons we don't know the details is that they haven't done a survey even of what is underground since the Soviet Union collapsed. But the other thing to keep in mind is that what the deal does not include, right? Based on some of the atmospherics surrounding it, which is it doesn't require Ukraine to repay for the lethal military assistance that we provided beforehand, which was something that was bandied about. It does not include any concrete security guarantees, right? And it doesn't designate any mineral rights, right? So all of the issues about reducing political risk that Ed mentioned really matter, but they take place in a context where we don't know exactly what the mineral wealth is. There are no operational rare earth mineral mines in Ukraine. You have a war going on. A number of these mines are in those in the occupied areas. Yet you're still seeing shelling across Ukraine. So there's and the Ukrainian energy context is a regulatory mess, right? So those kinds of political risks that Ed is mentioning for industry who is gonna decide the fate of this deal are really challenged, as he mentioned. But the other element to this deal that has been touted as a sign of US commitment to Ukraine. And let me just give you a sense of how we should be thinking about that. So on the one hand, yes, I would agree with Ed that this is a political gesture that contrasts vividly with the summit meeting with President Zelensky that we all witnessed. So this is certainly better, shows the atmospherics are much better. But if you're trying to signal anything to Russia about a security commitment to Europe, to Ukraine, this seems like a lot of cheap talk because one, remember what happened in February 2022. All of the Western investment within Russia did not seem to deter Russia from taking action when it saw that its interest, whether or not you agree with that or not, but Putin certainly saw the value of taking that action. And was not deterred by the investments that were much greater in Russia itself. And the context within which this deal has been negotiated. This is not a situation where we are negotiating up a set of level of commitments to Ukraine, right? So we're going from 0 to, okay, we're going to invest and leaving increased lethal military assistance and maybe forward basing or managing the airspace on the table. No, this is taken in the context of, no, we're not going to provide that military assistance. And so this is second best. Well, if Russia wasn't deterred by the investments that we were making before, and we're telling them, and we're fighting with our allies over what our military commitment is going to be to Ukraine, it's hard to imagine that there's any valuable security guarantee to the investments that could even be unlocked if those political risks were reduced. So it's not clear at all in a security context that this really would matter fundamentally to deter Russia's actions. Now, and you can also see that by Putin's response, right? His response wasn't just to ratchet up. Rather, he saw it for what it was, and he invited the US to invest in Russian critical minerals and energy resources. So you can see that the security dimension to this gesture was seen in Moscow, regardless of what the intentions may have been in Washington, and I'm agnostic about that. And I'm certainly agnostic about and don't know how to navigate the political risk from a company's perspective. But as a strategic thinker, which Putin is, this does not seem to be a very convincing signal of a security commitment to Ukraine.
We're going to go to audience questions in just a minute, but I'd like to congratulate the panel. We've got a full hour without saying the T word, tariffs. But I will add a question in here. What impact have trade barriers such as sanctions and tariffs had on energy trade within Europe, but also with external partners?
I would start by saying, as someone who worked in the international oil and gas business for most of my career, trade restrictions are not what I hope for. Free and fair trade would be better than having sanctions. There are always political reasons why sanctions may be put on, but they tend to distort the market in inefficient ways. So can anyone here guess who is the biggest importer of Russian oil by sea today?
India.
Very good.
Yeah.
India used to import practically zero oil from Russia. And today it's been importing up to 2 million barrels a day. No one here knows what a barrel is. Doesn't mean these figures don't mean anything, which is why this does such a bad job telling the story. A barrel is 42 gallons. It's multiplied 2 million barrels per day, 42. That's how much Russian oil India imports every single day from zero. Well, we say, well, why would that be? Well, India sits right next to the Persian Gulf. Why would you want to import Russian oil all the way from the Baltic Sea or the Black Sea? So it distorts the economics completely, right? Russian gas goes to China, 3 times the distance of Russian gas going to Europe. Pipelines that need to be built yet, right? In some cases. So it is terribly economically inefficient, and by the way, damaging for greenhouse gas emissions at the same time. So, trade restrictions are a way of distorting the market in an inefficient way, even though there may be political justification for doing it. It's also much easier to put in tariffs than or sanctions than to remove sanctions. And they tend to stick around for a long time. And it never solves the political problem either. When was the last time sanctions and trade restriction solved a political problem? It can be part of a menu of tools that governments can use solve a international or political problem, but it cannot not by itself achieve the objectives. And I think the sanctions on Russian energy has shown that, right? The other thing that we should talk about is not very in vogue now because we've got bigger trade war issues, is carbon border adjustment tax. And the European wish to exercise that, seen by the United States certainly and other countries as protections rather than strictly a climate policy. So it does distort the market in many ways. The market is now upside down. When you have energy going greater distances to market because of sanctions.
Let me just take, I mean, again, I agree with everything we said.
I
I know, yeah, so let's look at sanctions on Russia. I mean, why were they imposed? They were not imposed for economic reasons, they were imposed for political reasons, and we all know they've had very little effect, other than maybe affecting the costs of Russia's waging the war, but it hasn't altered their strategy even over the course of the war that we've seen. Now, so there's a real question about the utility of sanctions on Russia for changing their strategic behavior. And Russia is not Iran in the nuclear context. It is a much bigger economic beast. But the other thing to keep in mind about the sanctions on Russia is that they were never designed to cut Russia off. In fact, the oil price cap was really designed to keep oil on the market, but to reduce revenues to Russia. And so this is part of the way that the EU was able to transition, and the US was able to, still ratchet up pressure on Russia without affecting the market. So again, very, one hand, it could be a smart perspective. You don't want to undermine and distort the market further. On the other hand, it's sending a pretty weak signal to Russia. The other thing about sanctions I would note is that there's a difference between the cost that Russia's incurred today versus over time. And one of the things that I think we're not talking a lot about is it's not about just a ceasefire, but what happens to Russia after this fighting stops. And when we look at Russia's energy sector, especially the oil sector, it is really hurting from a long period of underinvestment. Sanctions have exacerbated those problems, and of course mismanagement along the way. And so,
you have a very, decrepit industry moving forward, not to mention the cutoffs in the gas and oil pipeline. So, I wouldn't say that sanctions are irrelevant, and they certainly cause pain, but they were never designed to cause too much pain, and they certainly weren't effective at altering Russia's strategic behavior. And we can maybe unpack some of those later if you do Q&A. On tariffs, on the US side, so one of the gestures of the Trump administration is coupled with the tariffs is the opportunity for Europe to buy long-term contracts on natural gas, LNG from the United States as a way to reduce some of those tariffs. And again, these are going to be private sector decisions, so it's not clear what that would be. Also, if Europe is committed to an energy transition, as Ed mentioned, it's not clear what long-term contracts, what value they have in this. But if the Trump administration or DC or anybody tries to lean too heavily on the tariff element, it will affect how Europe makes those decisions, again, on that trilemma between sustainability and affordability and energy security. And if they're feeling less and less secure about their situation vis-a-vis Russia, and they're feeling more and more under pressure, economically speaking, and the economic competitiveness from not only China, but also the United States, that may lead them to double down more and operate and erect their own borders and to move away from US natural gas rather than towards it, creating potentially an opportunity for Russia to deliver more of its LNG into Europe. So, using economic statecraft can be effective under certain circumstances against certain types of markets if they're tailored and they have finite objectives and time horizons. The other thing I'll just mention about the sanctions on Russia that I forgot to is that if you're in Moscow, you've just seen an accumulation of the thousands of sanctions imposed on you. What has been the record of lifting sanctions? Right? There's almost no research actually on the lifting of sanctions. And very little confidence, I'll guarantee you, in Russia and Moscow, Putin or not, from all the different stakeholders there, that sanctions are going to be relaxed. And so expecting sanctions to carry an effective political signal when the target, in this case Russia, feels like they have no more to lose. It seems like the marginal value of moving forward with sanctions and moving the meter with it, Russia is actually diminished considerably.
What questions do we have from the audience? Barry?
A couple of years ago, I saw a keynote address by a CEO of a African micro energy company. Based on the picture that you've laid out now about the instability of supply side and the reality of the fragility of the transmission side of energy, my question is, is there a learning going on in transferring that knowledge of regions that have always lived with unstable or intermittent energy and micro energy production that requires no grid, and coupling that with solar? Is there any learning going on from that? And with that close relationship that they have with Africa, it would seem like that would be a good way to transfer knowledge. And if not, why are they not thinking about the reality of this mass integrated energy dependent world is not realistic to be maintained because of renewable?
There's a general problem of energy poverty around. There are, I think, close to 1 billion people around the world that don't have regular access to electricity. And most of them are in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia. And there are certain structural problems having to do with people's ability to pay. So private sector investment don't tend to come if there is no secure way of collecting payments. People do tend to think of access to energy as a social good. And if it's a social good, then governments could step in to provide the financing behind it. But I think it still requires people to pay something, not nothing, right? And so what's good about these microsystems is that people can acquire access to energy, whether to, you know, power their mobile phones or to have, you know, cooking fuel that doesn't require cutting down trees and making charcoal and things that are much worse solutions. I think that both the Biden and Obama administrations had programs that AIDE was heavily behind on addressing energy poverty, particularly in Africa. I fear where those programs are today. But solar distributed power generation with solar at kind of a smaller scale, I think has great utility. And so, but it requires probably smaller, more entrepreneurial companies to advance that these, you know, large companies that are looking at, you know, you can't get the attention of the big companies that, you know, make billions of dollars in profits every quarter, right? So I think it requires a different kind of businesses to get into that space. But I agree with you, the potential is huge and it's much needed too. We saw the technological leap of mobile phones, which is quite instructive. You know, people couldn't get landlines in most of the world, so they had no phone access. But you know, but they pay for that phone. Maybe a Chinese phone, but they pay for that phone somehow and pay for that service somehow because at an individual level, it made economic sense, right? And so the trick is how to do that in the case of electricity at the same time. But I don't know probably enough about the subject to know why the lessons learned from that isn't being more broadly spread.
I don't really have much to add to this, other than I would say that, I mean, it is playing out somewhat in Europe with respect to the notion about enhancing the grids and making them more robust versus, you know, having much more distributed smaller things. And I think that's where this issue plays out. I've not seen it framed as lessons from Africa or other energy starved areas because politically that's probably not the framing that they're going to want to use to explain this. So I think the concepts that are related to what you're talking about are coming out more in the conversation about more distributed or localized responses. And this would be one of the things I would look for in some of the lessons learned from the Spain and Portugal blackouts to see how that's framed in that context of having more distributed, localized access to management.
Next month, thanks for your talk this morning. I just have a question. Oil a couple of days ago, didn't follow today, was about $60 a barrel. And selling it for Russia, selling to China and to India, they're obviously giving them a discount. At what point in time will that price to India and China be lower than their cash cost? And when is it really going to start to hurt Russia to fund their war at $60 a barrel or less of oil?
Well, let me answer the question on cost, if you can answer the question on revenue and ability to wage war. Russia can go down to very low oil prices. This is not well understood, including by the US Treasury Department, that sets $60 per barrel price too high. In traditional oil and gas production, what you're concerned about is not your sunk costs, but your incremental costs. Now, this is a little different for shale, so let's take shale aside, but there's not much shale going on in Russia. You keep pumping at $10 a barrel, $20 a barrel. And people say, well, why? Isn't that below your average cost of production? And the answer is yes. But so what? The investment I made, it sunk. It's already gone. The question is whether you want to get the extra $20 tomorrow or not. And so as long as the current price of oil is higher than my incremental costs, not my total costs, whether you're in the United States or Russia, you keep producing. And the reason is that barrel of oil that you don't produce today, that doesn't get produced tomorrow. It gets produced at the end of the life of that field, which may be 20 years from that. And what's the net present value of that? Right? So now people ask, when the oil price of oil collapsed, and what year was that? 2020, I think. Why do these stupid oil people keep producing? Well, that's because they do their sums differently than the average person would do the sums. And so I would say the break even for Russia, I would say it's closer to $20 than it is to $60.
So then the other part of the question is, when is this gonna hurt Russia, and what does that mean? So, I mean, it is, and from an economic perspective, I mean, they've taken, last 2 years, lower oil prices, lower revenues, it's taken a hit about 40% of the federal budget, and as a result, moving forward, they're anticipating a projected 1.7% deficit for this year. So there are economic costs to this. But again, economic costs are not, Russia's on a wartime economy footing. And Putin has demonstrated time again that he's willing to pay considerable material, certainly economic costs. And he's able to, he's seems to be reluctant to, call up through formal draft, but through a variety of other volunteers, raiding prisons, using North Korean soldiers, using mercenaries, using regional forces. He's been able to solve this manpower problem and subsidize those families. And if you look at where he's recruiting, it's really the soft underbelly of Russia, which are the more economically challenged parts of the country. So it seems like he's still, from our vantage point, a relatively large economic cushion. And this isn't really about affecting, the decision about the war are not being driven by economic costs, especially when either he's offered nothing or he feels that he can solve his problems on the ground, right? So it's not clear that either the sanctions or the oil prices or even lower oil prices are having a short-term effect on a strategic calculation of a country that is now increasingly moved to a war footing and has willing to pay costs to secure its position in Ukraine. That said, there are long-term costs that these are imposing on Putin. I mentioned the deterioration of the oil industry. The one thing that sanctions is, so one way that the Russians have been able to get around the sanctions that, as I mentioned, were never designed to prevent Russian oil from getting there, but been able to get, and the India case is actually one where the system was working, right? Price caps, we didn't mind if they were buying more and more oil from Russia because Russia was earning less than they were, with the price cap, right? So we were reducing the incentives to cheat. But they were cheating with these shadow fleets and things like that. And so there has been really since the end of 2024, a dramatic shift in the way that we're implementing, and the Europeans and OFAC are implementing targeting the shadow fleet. And I think that will have an impact, but again, over long term. These actions are more likely to affect the Russia after the war than the Russia during the war. And I think they matter because the after the war Russia could be a bigger problem for Europe and the international community than the problem that is posed to the broader set of interests in Ukraine today. Of course, this is extremely painful for the Ukrainians, so I don't need to downplay that. But in terms of the strategic cost and the strategic issue that a vacuum of power that Russia could create in that part of the world will raise a whole host of other issues. And if these economic costs and the infrastructure is depreciating at such a grand rate, or they're no longer plugged in to other markets, that's going to be a bigger issue moving forward. So they do matter, but not for, I think, the calculations with respect to the war fighting that we're seeing.
I think Dr. Stolberg, just proposed our next symposium topic for after the war, hopefully sooner rather than later. Please join in thanking our panelists. A 15-minute break, so please enjoy some more coffee and breakfast. And we'll be back here at 10:05 for our next panel, Arming Europe's Defense, Adapting to New Threats and Shifting Alliances. We'll be building on this morning's conversation with this next panel, and we look forward to seeing you at 10:05. We'll get started. And we have gifts for both of you. Oh, sure. Where would you like us? In front of?
Here.
Oh,
Well, I'm sound in
We're gonna do a quick photo and then you.
Thank you very much. Wow.
Phoenix.
Just changed our pictures.
She might be Oh, I did. Great publicity. So.
But I do.
Yeah, with the fire. Diving into like deep waters, a different story.
It's definitely do. We can do it live. We don't have to do it on like, we can do it on economic normalcy. If they're local folks, you guys are tied into that. Yeah, I know. I think that'd be, I'm totally on board. The next time he comes,
Okay.
we can have lunch or something
No,
like
that
that.
I cannot set my timer.
Some program.
I would not start to do that.
Still in my teens when I was jumping up tower.
Yeah, okay. What happens like more ventures?
It was just something I did.
That's a good story that I can remember. But jumping to the tower. To the ocean or the river.
Started off man-made.
I never been to
Alabama. No, and it was fun. They used to go out. There's like a. Like gloves.
See so many people network and reflecting on our.
I realized I
You have somebody joining us from the Netherlands. I will introduce you in a moment.
like that.
Let's solve it down.
Because I feel like I'm
Like I was one of the girls that was not.
So the topic of the next panel, the title is Arming Europe's Defense, Adapting to New Threats and Shifting Alliances. In this panel, we examine Europe's strategic shift toward increased armament in response to emerging threats and changing alliances. The discussion reflects on Germany's Zeitenwende in 2022, which marked a significant turning point in European defense policy. The panelists analyze the continent-wide efforts to bolster defense capabilities and its entities surrounding long-standing security alliances with the US. And the conversation underscores the urgency of adapting to new geopolitical realities and safeguarding Europe from diverse threats. Our distinguished speakers today are Katja Weber and Stefan Despiglieri. I hope I said that right, Stefan. You can hear me?
Very good, very well, thank you.
Katja is a professor in the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology here in Atlanta. Her research interests center around institution building in Europe and Asia Pacific, sovereignty-related human rights norms, non-traditional security challenges, and German foreign policy. Stefan is principal scientist at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies in the Netherlands. His current work focuses on strategic defense management, security resilience, network centrism, capabilities-based planning, and the transformation of defense planning. Please join me in extending a warm round of applause and welcome for Katja and Stefan. Katja has some slides and presentation to set the stage, and then we'll allow Stefan to make some opening remarks, and then we'll get to the fireside chat and audience Q&A. Yeah, the stage is yours.
Well, so to set the stage for our discussion, I think it's important to recall that it is threat assessment that really drives alliance behavior. So I would like to do a brief recap of how we got to where we are today. And I know that many of you are quite familiar with the history, but I like to repaint these in broad strokes. So in the aftermath of World War II, I would argue that the threat initially was political in nature, namely the fear of Soviet infiltration, which of course led to the Truman Doctrine, where President Truman pledged to support the free peoples susceptible to pressure by Soviets and domestic communist movements. Moreover, at that time, there was a need to strengthen Western Europe via the Marshall Plan, which was a European economic recovery program, because it was clearly felt that because the weak and impoverished Western Europe was an open invitation to the Soviet Union to extend its political dominion. Then in 1948, the Soviets sought to impose tighter controls over Eastern Europe. In the spring of 48, for instance, the Communist Party of the of Czechoslovakia seized control over the government in Prague. And in March, there was a telegram by General Clay, who was stationed in Germany at the time, basically informing the US administration that war might come with dramatic suddenness. These developments then led to the signing of the Brussels Pact, which then was a military alliance between Great Britain, France, and the Benelux countries. And now it becomes clear that there is a need for the US to play a more active role, giving rise to initially secret North Atlantic treaty talks with the UK and Canada. The threat increases further with the Berlin blockade. So then in 1949, we get the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty and ultimately giving rise to NATO. Then in September 49, an atomic explosion in the Soviet Union was detected. This was followed in 1950 by the outbreak of the Korean War, which of course led to massive defense expenditures. It was followed in 1950. As you said, Korean War, but it's important to understand that the Soviet Union was not the only threat at the time. The Europeans also were very much concerned about a resurgent in Germany. So this then prompted Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman to propose the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community in April of 1951, which, as everybody knows, was a free trade area with respect to iron, ore, coal, and steel. So yes, it's an economic agreement, but it had very significant security implications. Namely, it was to make war between France and Germany materially impossible. And of course, the European Coal and Steel Community marks the beginnings of what today is the European Union. Then in the early 1950s, with the intensification of the Cold War and the outbreak of the Korean War, there was a need for greater West European contributions in the area of defense, and especially a pressing need for West German integration into the Western Alliance. This then led Jean Monnet and René Pleven to propose the creation of a European army, European Defense Community. So after drawn-out negotiations, the ETC Treaty was signed in 1952, but the Assemblée Nationale, the French Parliament, failed to ratify the treaty in 1954. This obviously meant that greater European integration in the security realm could not be achieved at this time. However, under British leadership, the Brussels Treaty was expanded to now include West Germany and Italy. And France then agreed to West German rearmament within NATO. But as everybody knows, it wasn't always smooth sailing within NATO. There were disagreements about Suez, the development of missiles, disagreements which caused France to pull out of shape the military arm of NATO. There were burden-sharing disagreements and so on. Now, this uncertainty regarding future cooperative prospects within NATO prompted François Duchesne, the director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, in October of 1971, made the case for Europe to develop a more independent military capability. But at that time, common political will was lacking, so it didn't come about. Fast forward to the end of the Cold War, which led, of course, to a reassessment of threat, and several new threats were detected, namely largely non-traditional security challenges, but also, of course, the crises in the former Yugoslavia, 9/11, and so on. So NATO reacted with internal and external adaptation. And as a result of these new crises, the Europeans recognized their utter dependence on the US, and that they would not be able to take significant military action other than crisis management, humanitarian assistance without the United States. Therefore, the Europeans were rethinking their own security structures, and then we get the alphabet soup, we get ESDP, European Security and Defense Policy, we get CSDP, and so on. So then fast forward to the war in Ukraine, where Russia used this as defending itself against an increasingly defensive West, as the NATO borders have been pushed further and further east. And NATO, of course, views the war as an attack on a sovereign country. So in short, these changes in threat led to the developments that we are discussing in this panel today.
Thank you so much. Stefan, would you like to make some opening remarks?
Yes, I would actually. Thank you, Ricky. Also, greetings from a warm The Hague, as you see behind me. The Hague that's preparing for the NATO summit, of course, which is a huge event here. I just wanted to start with two comments, basically, which are often underestimated, I think. By the way, let me also thank the World Affairs Council. I mean, there's never been a more important part to have time to have organization like yours to keep the debate going and also to maintain the transatlantic link, right? Whatever we hear about the United States these days, it's a very different sound. So I'm glad to hear that these discussions are still taking place in the US. But so the first comment I want to make is that Europe really does have a fairly different approach towards defense and security. I mean, Katja started her story at the end of World War II. And that's, of course, a perfectly legitimate thing to do. But I think it's important to also go back a little bit further in history. There's a wonderful time-lapse video on YouTube of a guy, a French digital visualizer, who showed the incidents of war across history since like 4,000 years before Christ. And a striking phenomenon in there is the centrality of war, or the centrality of Europe in war. So prior to the end of World War II, Europe had engaged in 2 centuries of fratricidal wars in which we were constantly paranoid about our neighbors, in which we were constantly planning either offensively or defensively for attacks from these neighbors. And in 1945, which of course in Germany is called die Stunde Null, right? The 0 hour. We found ourselves at the lowest point ever, precisely, or not only, but certainly partially because of this fratricidal history that we've had. And so most of us Europeans felt that we needed another solution than the zero-sum game approaches to defense and security. And that's why, and Katja did tell that story nicely, we came up with this idea of European integration as an antidote to these things. An antidote that we felt and still feel is a far superior one to the black and white images that are once again taking us over. So I still think a lot of Europeans feel today that Putin has not only drawn his own country back to the darkest days of Russian history, it has also drawn Ukraine back to those darker days, where indeed nationalism and the need for military responses is generally accepted. And it is doing the same to Western Europe. Western Europe, which felt fairly isolated from all these events, we felt we had found a new solution to these security dilemmas that have bedeviled us for oh so long. And now we feel obliged to go back to a history that we really don't want to go back to. So you said, I mean, the panel is called New Threats, right? For us, a lot of these threats are actually old threats that are resurfacing, that are bringing back memories from periods that we really don't want to go back to. So we have no alternative but to go there. And that'll be the second part of my introductory comment. But I do think it's important, you may recall the aphorism by Robert Kagan that Europe is from Venus and the United States is from Mars. And that's, of course, a very simplistic way of putting it. But it is really true that our approaches to defense and security have been very different, are realigning in a way, but are still quite different than what the general. So Americans often feel that we don't do enough. That is proving to be the case. But it is also still the case that we do not want to go back to the darkest days that we've had before. Now, the second point I want to make, that this time it really is serious. And I don't know to what extent Americans realize that. So if I forget for a moment about all the politics and the military stuff, every European family now, from the Baltics all the way to Spain, has probably had the discussion about, the European Union has told us all that we need to have 72 hours of provisions in home. So we're all thinking about those things. Many companies have to start thinking about business continuity measures for the case in which a large percentage of their workforce, male, but probably also female, may have to be called away to do other things. So the entire society is really shifting quite a bit from this postmodern island of stability into an island that still wants to be different from the rest of the world, that sort of feels itself propelled to a position of leadership because of the developments in the United States, that it does not really necessarily want, that it may not be able to sustain, but that we sort of feel compelled to walk towards. So I think these are just two general comments. First of all, we are different. We have different histories, different geographies, different political economies. That is, the weight, for instance, of defense industry in Europe is much smaller. It's coming up again now, but that these are very profound structural and ideational differences between the old world and the new world. And then secondly, that really the debate is quite serious now, whereby even some very unexpected parties, even political parties that share the need now for more defense efforts, despite all the economic issues that we have, whereby various pacifist movements are turning around, where defense spending is really going up significantly. So, and where we are starting to have debates even within families about what if. And that leads to a lot of the institutional and financial and military changes that I'm sure we'll discuss during the discussion. Let me stop here to give us time for the actual debate.
Thank you so much, Stefan and Katja, for your opening remarks. So we'll start, we've got the screen up, slide here up on the screen with Zeitenwende. Let's start this, as Stefan pointed out, this didn't start in 2022. However, the moment we're in today, we can trace back to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, February 2022. What is or was Zeitenwende, and how has it actually dominoed and really affected all of European defense policy and the cut and strategic shift toward increased armament?
Katja, do you want to start?
Sure. So yes, Zeitenwende, a historic turning point that I think everybody heard about when then Chancellor Olaf Scholz basically suggested that Germany would now increase its defense spending very significantly. You can imagine the reaction of various of the European countries. This announcement of this massive defense spending sent chills down the spine of many countries. All, of course, the horrors of the two world wars. In the aftermath, Western allies sought to prevent an independent German army. That's why I mentioned the plans for a European army, because it was precisely so important to make sure that Germany would no longer have an independent army with which it could threaten its neighbors again. At the end of World War II, of course, a German independent army was supposed to be prevented, but also, of course, Germany should not have nuclear or biological or chemical weapons. The same unease about this militarily powerful nuclear capable Germany was felt again during the 2+4 agreement, which states that the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republics reaffirm their renunciation of the manufacture, possession, and control of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. So you can imagine Zeitenwende was not that well received by Germany's allies. So it wasn't implemented immediately due to domestic infighting. The left in Germany argued that increased military spending would lead to an arms race. The Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD, claimed that NATO had aggrieved Russia by discussing the possibility of Ukrainian membership. So then what changed? I would argue what changed is that we see very significantly increased uncertainty regarding both the actions of Russia, but also, of course, the US. Regarding Putin's next moves, will he stop at Ukraine? And will he move further west? If we think about recent US behavior, when President Trump returned to office, he upended decades of US policy on Russia. He threatened to withdraw aid from Ukraine, then he paused it, then he tried to force Ukraine to accept the very favorable peace treaty, and made surrender of its parts of its minerals that we've talked about in the previous panel. At times, the US seems to realign with Russia. The US didn't include the Europeans in peace talks. It even negotiated without Zelensky. This is very unpredictable behavior. President Trump, moreover, repeatedly stated that the US won't defend its allies if they don't pay enough, even though many of the NATO countries, of course, have increased their defense spending very considerably. And President Trump had threatened NATO members, Canada and Denmark. So often, he's preoccupied with increasingly assertive China rather than paying attention on Europe. So therefore, the Europeans have to envision a future without US support. And in the near future, the significant drawdown of US troops in Europe. It's noteworthy that the number of US forces in Europe has fluctuated between 75,000 to 105,000 since 2022, with about 63,000 permanently assigned, while others are on a rotating basis. So the point I want to make is that it is precisely this uncertainty regarding Russian but also US behavior that makes the Europeans wonder whether the US would defend Europe should Russia attack any NATO countries. And of course, this uncertainty is not a new phenomenon in international relations. We've seen this over and over again. Think about French President Charles de Gaulle questioning President Kennedy whether the US would risk trading New York for Paris. And it was this uncertainty that led the French to create its independent nuclear deterrent in the 1960s. But what we see now is a continent-wide scramble to defend Europe, because the Europeans believe that they relied on the US far too long and are told by the US to step up instead of being fighters.
Yeah, and let me just add a few things. It's hard to overestimate the importance of this Zeitenwende for Germany, of course, which has made probably a bigger turnaround than many other European countries, but also for the other European countries. So February 24th was indeed, in 2022, was a huge shock to every analyst, politician, citizen. This was so against everything that Europe had fought so hard for decades, to do things differently. And here all of a sudden you have a callous, brutal, unwarranted, large-scale attack with conventional armed forces crossing borders in ways that we had just hoped that wouldn't be done anymore. And yes, that is sort of a wake-up call, if you want to call it that, for the entire European political, economic, social fabric, a shock which we're still trying to recover from. So Germany has had a big change, certainly in thinking. We still have to see to what extent the results of this change of thinking will materialize. There are some positive trends here, but there's also some political and other obstacles that make it very hard to generate the capability that would be required to deal with a Russian further attack. And by the way, Katja is of course right in talking about uncertainty. But I think the big change is that we had uncertainty for a couple of decades prior to that. There was no main enemy. It wasn't really clear what we had our defense organizations for. So that was, for military planners, that was a degree of uncertainty that if they felt very uncomfortable with. They now feel like they have much more certainty again. There is a threat. We don't know whether it will materialize or not, but it's much more visible than it has ever been before. And that focus of mind, that actually decrease in uncertainty, that the focus of military efforts, that is something that's really triggering a lot of massive changes. And these are happening across the board. And so, of course, the closer you get to Russia in Europe, the more that sense of urgency is palpable and has also already materialized in very concrete things, which are now not always buying more military materiel, but also much more resilience, much more other types of efforts. But if you go further away from the Russian border, it decreases. But even in, like, for instance, the Netherlands is far away from Russia. But even here, that sense of urgency is very much felt. So where it is felt a little bit less still is in countries like Spain and Portugal and Italy for a combination of political and geostrategic reasons. But it's really hard to underestimate indeed this Zeitenwende, a German word, but a word that's applicable to Germany itself, but also to the rest of Europe. And as I already hinted, in very unpredictable ways. A lot of these debates would have been thought totally impossible prior to that ominous date in European history. where one actor decided to pull Europe back to its darker days, and in which we now feel compelled to make the efforts that indeed we hadn't been making for a long time, and now we feel that because of this change of times, we just are obliged to do.
Thank you, Stefan. To follow up on that, now that the US is no longer the ultimate guarantor of European security, you're having these conversations every day. What is being discussed in the halls of The Hague and elsewhere in Europe in terms of what are the efforts, the driving, the efforts to bolster defense capabilities in Europe?
Yeah, so I mean, we talked about the first shock, right, which is the one that, Russia triggered. The second massive shock, of course, is the US, the leader of the free world, that has decided to take a different route, to also uproot decades of a particular attitude to its international role. And that's, of course, another major shock for us. Now, to be fair again, a lot of these things predated all of this. I mean, the focus away the United States from Europe to Asia has a long-standing, was very much a reality for decades, but it didn't have the sort of urgency that it has now. So that's something that already happened before. Also, European defense identity has also doesn't start after the invasion of the large-scale invasion of Ukraine. It antedates that, but it's been accelerated and fueled with a lot more money, thinking, institutional boldness, right? I mean, the European Union is incomprehensible for most non-Europeans. It's even very hard to grasp for Europeans, and it's very complicated. But it is an amazing mechanism whereby, for instance, the coronavirus did not lead to a weakening of the European Union, but led to a ratcheting up of this process of integration in ways that it would never have been thought possible. For instance, both Germany and the Netherlands have always been very reluctant to let the European Union get money in other ways. Well, coronavirus allowed for that European debt that could be invested in dealing with that particular crisis. The same is happening now again. So these are all processes that had been developing for a long time, but that somehow got jolted into much more political and economic, financial urgency right now. And indeed, the strategic autonomy, which has been a debate that's been going on for a long time, which France, but not only France, a lot of other countries also sometimes hide behind France on this. But France, of course, had been advocating this for a very long time. And even the more, let's say, Euro and Atlanticist countries are now changing the portfolio investment. I mean, you can think about these institutions as countries making portfolio investments in different solutions for their security problems. And so we have a national part of our portfolio, we have a European part of our portfolio, and we have a NATO part of our portfolio. What you will see happening is that a readjustment of that portfolio investment much more towards European solutions, where all sorts of old, almost visceral reluctances to Europeanize things are now losing from the imperatives that the geostrategic environment is pushing upon us. So even political parties, politicians, countries that were very reluctant to go too far towards strengthening the European capabilities out of fear of weakening NATO are now changing that. Now, bear in mind, NATO is still a very central piece in most of its member states in Europe, and that will not change, right? We know that in the next 2 years, it's going to be very tough. At least the next 2 years, maybe the next 4 years, it's going to be very tough to get from the United States what we would sort of expect from them. But we have really no alternative here. So I think we will play the long game on NATO. We will not totally lower our investments in NATO. We will just have to beef up the European and the national components. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's really national. There is no European army. There is no NATO army. NATO has very few capabilities of its own. It's national member states who cough up the money, who decide what to buy, who decide what to do. And so that's really gotten a huge boost now because of these two major shocks, the invasion of Ukraine and the United States, sort of geostrategic shift. And we're seeing the result of that.
What does this mean for a nuclear force posture?
Yeah, so that's part of the debate as well. I mean, maybe I can, or do you want to start, Katja?
Sure.
Go ahead.
So I wanted to talk about the war posture a little bit because France obviously now is contemplating expanding its nuclear to cover the European allies, given that we don't know whether the US nuclear umbrella will still defend the Europeans. But of course, there's doubt now whether France would protect Germany or Poland, much like I said earlier, that the French doubted that the US would protect them with its nuclear umbrella in the 60s, which at that point, of course, as I mentioned, led France to create its independent nuclear capabilities, the force of law. So this is important because now what we might see is nuclear proliferation in Europe, something that definitely we do not want. Poland, for instance, has not ruled out pursuing its own nuclear capabilities, but such a move, of course, would trigger a preemptive Russian military action to stop Poland. So these are very dangerous developments. Poland is pursuing its nuclear capabilities, but could also lead to a nuclear arms race on the European continent, with other countries, both inside and outside of NATO, following suit. This would be extremely destabilizing. So the best case scenario, really, as pointed out by two scholars in an recent article in Foreign Affairs by Bell and Hoffman, would be non-proliferation and a credible deterrence. This suggests some version of British and French nuclear deterrence appears to be best and avoids the risk of proliferation. It could be faster and cheaper than conventional armament. Because conventional armament and stationing troops in various countries is quite expensive. Yet the French and British nuclear weapons could only provide retaliation, not preemptive action, as the US nuclear capabilities could. Also, French and British leaders would have to change their nuclear doctrines and declare that they would be prepared to prevent the conventional defeat of their Eastern European allies. We were not sure that that is something that would happen. And they would have to increase the scale and diversity of their nuclear arsenal. And that most likely would receive a lot of opposition from their own parties. One could, for instance, see opposition from Marine Le Pen's party. So clearly at this point, it would be best not to overreact, not to panic, and see whether conversations among the Europeans could prevent this nuclear arms race. One needs to keep in mind that Russian military capabilities are not that great at present. Russia struggles militarily in Ukraine. But there's a need for artillery, for drones, for air and missile defense in Europe. So the point here is, let's not overreact, but rather spend wisely and pool resources, something that Ivan has already mentioned. So it is encouraging that the defense spending among the European members of NATO was 50% higher in 2024 than it was in 2014 when Russia first attacked Ukraine. But still, more needs to be done because European militaries are not ready to fight. A recent study from two European think tanks, namely Bruegel and the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, estimated that to replace the expected contributions of US forces in wartime, Europe would require a minimum of 1,400 tanks, 200 infantry fighting vehicles, and 700 artillery pieces. They also need to develop critical capabilities, including satellite communications, advanced air and missile defense, conduct high intensity and sustained combat operations. Of course, this is not that easy, right? EU members and firms are reluctant to share sensitive information with each other, and they disagree on the appropriate amount of third country involvement in European defense industrial policy. So there are lots of obstacles to this, but still, we need to be cautious here, not overreact, and definitely not get us in a world where we'll see nuclear proliferation on the European continent.
I mean, if I can just make a comment on, I mean, the nuclear non-proliferation regime is already in very grave, has already been in very grave danger for a long time. We've seen de facto proliferation. And not to put too fine a point on it, but the recent developments, you know, Russia's nuclear deterrent did not deter Ukraine from invading and holding on to pieces of Russian territory, which is what Russian military doctrine precisely says the nuclear thing is supposed to do, that they're allowed to use those things. It didn't work there. We may be on the eve of a larger conflict between two nuclear powers, India and Pakistan, right? I mean, on the news all the time now. So the regime that underpinned a lot of the debates for the past few decades is really being rethought quite dramatically. And of course, Europe's predicament now means that this is definitely on the agenda. France has put it on the agenda. The UK is in a particular tough spot too. They are more dependent on the United States for their nuclear submarines than they would like to be. So there's really a massive rethink about the use of nuclear weapons, the value of it, whether the non-proliferation regime can even survive. And if not, what are the implications for Europe then? So there's a bunch of different issues that converge here and that make the debate on a potential future European nuclear option a very serious one. Also, do not underestimate the enormous turnaround of France on this. Right? General de Gaulle famously said, "Le nucléaire ne se partage pas." You cannot share nuclear arms. The French establishment has totally changed that. I mean, even there was a poll recently in Germany as well on on sort of a nuclear option, in which 53% of Germans were actually willing to start these discussions from happening. So this change of mind is quite astounding. And it's hard to see where the end, where we will end up at the end, also on the nuclear issue. But it's certainly not something that we should dismiss out of hand. So Katja's right. I mean, there's of course grave dangers with proliferation, but proliferation is happening. And do we sit on the sidelines and watch all of this happen? Or do we go for the sort of, indeed, nuclear weapons are expensive, but when compared to the conventional options, it actually offers quite a bit of advantages. And that in the debate will play a role. You know, we now have to choose between education and healthcare and defense. We know we're going to have to spend more on defense, but it's very unpopular for very good reasons. And so the appeal of a nuclear shortcut becomes bigger even for parties where you wouldn't have expected it. So it seems like on all these issues, all the cards are on the table now in ways that they haven't been since the end of World War II. And that's probably a healthy thing, because we do have to think much more deeply and hopefully wisely about these things. But it's really, you should not underestimate the dynamics behind all this stuff and how they could lead to very unpredictable outcomes, not only in the US, but also in Europe.
I will just take a pause and let the audience know that Adam Tooze is an economist, and he recently did a podcast on the economics of nuclear armament. And his point was what Stefan was saying, is actually relatively inexpensive for a country to consider arming itself with nuclear warheads compared to other traditional forms of warfare. Not particularly encouraging, but I think the term if I heard you right, Stefan, you call it a nuclear shortcut.
Well, yeah, I mean, in that sense it is, right? Basically, that's what Russia did after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They didn't have the money to sustain a conventional force, so they went to the nuclear force. And it's only when Putin started thinking about, really needing more territory that they started beefing up their conventional capabilities again. So yeah, I mean, certainly for some countries it has been that, and it is an option that's on the table now for Europe as well. And like I said, hopefully in a wise way and not in a totally destabilizing way, but it is on the table.
Well, let's turn to NATO. You're in The Hague, Stefan. How are European countries preparing for the NATO summit in 5 or 6 weeks, just over a month?
Well, there's always different tracks here, right? So there's the diplomats who are working on the language of the communique, many parts of which, of course, are already known. So there will be a financial commitment to that. There's a whole bunch of new funds that are being created, both within the EU and with NATO. And there's the concrete targets that are going to be set. So that's sort of the one debate that's taking place in our diplomatic corridors all around Europe and transatlantically, of course. But then there's also these national debates, and they are, like I already said, right? There's a lot of thinking going on in Europe now on the EU option, and that's actually probably a more vibrant debate than the NATO debate, because there's a bit of defeatism on NATO as well. On NATO, there's sort of a sense of like damage control, and what can we still salvage that makes sense for most of us. Whereas on the EU side, you have much more, proactive and creative debates, I would say. But yeah, preparations for the summit are going full blast, and they will continue to do so. And here, the uncertainty that Katja talked about, this transactional U.S. administration is hard to game, both by American and by Europeans. And so the degree of uncertainty in all of these debates is enormous. But it's still sort of I think it's sort of a serious effort by Europeans to see what can still be salvaged of this transatlantic link under the current circumstances, where we have to do more. We'd like to do much more just through NATO and through the way in which we've done it for the past few decades. But because that's becoming much more difficult, we have to look for alternatives, and that's where the European option comes in.
We're going to go to audience questions in just a moment, but I'd like for Katja to comment on, let's fast forward hopefully to the day after war in Ukraine, whether a peace deal is signed or however that comes to pass. Obviously, what Stefan is describing is what comes next and how does Europe defend itself from future potential attacks. Would Russia invade a NATO country?
It's obviously difficult to speculate. According to the Institute for the Study of War, which is a US-based think tank, the Kremlin sees independent countries once colonized by the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire as rightfully part of modern-day Russia. So that clearly is worrisome, or particularly those countries who are geographically close to Russia or bordering Russia. So Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were part both of the former USSR and the Russian Empire, as well as Moldova. So these countries are greatly concerned. Finland, one of NATO's newest members, which shares hundreds of miles of land border with Russia, was under the Russian Empire control in the 19th century. Large swaths of Poland were part of the Russian imperial territory. So if the fighting stops and Russian soldiers currently bogged down in eastern Ukraine are no longer there, then hundreds of thousands of troops will be available for Putin to use elsewhere. The intelligence agencies have estimated that Moscow would require about 5 years to reconstitute its military capabilities such that it could conduct a large-scale attack on a NATO country. In the event of a ceasefire or peace agreement with Ukraine, Russia would almost certainly seek to accelerate its rearmament. It now spends 40% of its federal budget on defense, or 9% of its GDP. So there's clearly that fear, and Lithuania has already unveiled an evacuation plan for its capital, Vilnius. Residents would be alerted via SMS and siren warnings. Lithuania shares a border with Belarus, a staunch Russian ally. It also shares a border with Kaliningrad, militarized Russian exclave. Other Baltic states, Latvia and Estonia, are deeply concerned about Russian aggression and have increased their defense spending very significantly. Estonia's Foreign Intelligence Service warned in February of 2024 that NATO could face Soviet-style mass army in the next decade if Russia successfully reforms its military. And the Danish Defense Intelligence Service said earlier this year that Russia would probably be more willing to use military force in a regional war against one or more European NATO countries if it perceives NATO as militarily weakened or politically divided. Poland was told by Secretary Hexe not to assume that America's presence will last forever. As a result of uncertainty over US security guarantees, Poland and France have said to sign a wide-ranging treaty covering defense and economic matters on May 9th, today. Officials have suggested that the Kremlin could attack NATO soil using hybrid warfare tactics rather than launching a more conventional military attack. Hybrid warfare refers to a range of activities stopping short of fighting, like cyber attacks, information campaigns, or targeting of vulnerable infrastructure such as undersea cables. And of course, we've already seen such an attack in the Baltic Sea. I think that's a point that Stefan has opinions about as well.
Well, it's just that, we don't just see in the Baltics, right? Russia is daily attacking virtually every European country in the information realm, in the cyber realm. It has been active in maritime waters in all sorts of different ways, also in the North Sea here, right next to about 10 kilometers from where I sit here. So this is happening all the time. And we should bear it in mind. So the discussions about the 5% money that should be spent on defense and security, which Secretary General Rutte has talked about, would be like 3.5% on traditional defense and 1.5% on all these other things, which is a huge amount of money, by the way. So we should not underestimate that this is already happening. Now, when we talk about physical attacks or territorial attacks that would cross borders, we just did a large study for the Dutch army in which we used about 300,000 Russian documents from mill bloggers, official statements. See, with these large language models that we have now in artificial intelligence in general, we can actually process a lot more of these data than before. And so one of the questions we looked at is, when we look, for instance, at Russian regeneration capabilities, are they regenerating to cover the losses that they've had in the Ukrainian war? That is, to be able to successfully conquer Ukraine, or do they go beyond that? And of course, what we see is that they go way beyond that. Now, the question is, how do we interpret that? So one way of interpreting that is indeed that they are preparing for a large-scale conflict with NATO. The other way to explain it is that they see the massive buildup of NATO along the border with Russia, and that they're just sort of defensively preparing against what they see as a very aggressive NATO posture along its borders. And there we go back to the debate that we've had for decades. How do you interpret these types of things? Or for instance, the large-scale exercises that took place just before the invasion of Ukraine, which many of us, including myself, thought that were just sort of, threatening, that they weren't going to actually do it, that they wouldn't be so insane as to try that, but they did it. So the point is, this is this black and white thinking I was thinking about before, right? And we're smack back in the middle of that. So we see all sorts of things coming out of the woodwork again, with this Manichaean black and white view, whereby we say they're overdoing it and they say we're overdoing it, whereby the danger of escalation is dangerously high, where we already have daily incursions, cyber and informational, that are taking place. So this is obviously a very infernal dynamic, which is precisely the dynamic that we had for the 2 centuries prior to the world wars, which led to other sorts of solutions. So I frankly, personally still hope that we Europeans will once again show some creativity, whereby we do not just go back to buying all sorts of kinetic stuff. If you think that the life cycle cost of an F-35 is about $400 million, which is an insane amount of money, and if you think about some of the alternative investment options that you would have, that you would be able to buy with the same amount of money in other areas, right? Also why are we not targeting more of the healthy fibers of Russian society? Not targeting militarily, but targeting with sort of, disinflammatory tools that would allow the Russian society to better understand the sort of infernal propaganda that's being unleashed on them. Why can't we? So there are probably other ways in which we can still try to bolster our defense and security. There is no way avoiding some beefing up of our kinetic capabilities. But what we will be seeing, the dangers of misspending in the next couple of years in Europe are insane. The amount of increases that we see at the speed at which we see them will almost certainly lead to incredible misappropriations of still very scarce defense euros. And the fact that we as researchers and as scholars have not developed a sort of strategic balance of investment tool that would allow us to judge how much security does an F-35 buy us versus 400 million in like an alternative. We don't have that. None of our countries have it. None of our defense departments have it. None of our accounting chambers have that. So that's sort of one of the terrible things, that we're being drawn back to the dark old days, and that we're not maybe putting enough creativity in trying to rediscover other ways to escape these Manichaean black and white ways of thinking, in trying to galvanize the healthy fibers that are still in the United States, in Russia, in Europe, to try to find other ways to solve these issues, just like European politicians did after World War II, right? And of course, then we required the defeat of Germany to make these kinds of debates possible. It's very unlikely that Russia will go through a different type of defeat. So we may have to be even more creative than that. But I, as a European who has spent my whole life working on defense and security, but who's not happy about our capability portfolio, not the way in which it is being generated, not the way in which it is being produced. When I look at American defense procurement, the role of pork barrel in the US Congress is just insane. So you end up with all sorts of decisions that may not be to the best interest of the American taxpayer. And the same is now happening, and is going to happen much more so in Europe. So we really have to be much more creative about these things. And that's why I hope that, just like we tried to show some creativity after World War II, by finding other ways to break through the security dilemma, that we can do the same thing now, before it goes too far, and before maybe Putin does decide to cross that threshold once again. That's sort of some thoughts that I wanted to still add.
What questions do we have from the audience? We'll wait for you to, we'll bring a microphone. Do we have a microphone? Well, we would love for Stefan to be able to hear you, which is why we need the microphones. Anna's gonna run grab some microphones. Thank you, Anna. Okay, thank you, Samson. We have a question here, raise your hand, and then here. So one and then two. Okay, two and then one. Oh, they both have mics, okay.
Question about the conventional weapons. You made a distinction between conventional weapons and nuclear deterrence and how it's cheaper. One part of this question is, well, if you have cheaper nuclear weapons, but you're not actually willing to use them, and you have an army marching across the border, weapons on fire city, not that should have known with nuclear weapons, then how much good does it do for actual defense? And if your enemy knows that you're not willing to use them, how much good does it do for her? And then the second part of it is conventional weapons is not just F-35s and such, but drones and much more lightweight, cheaper, more flexible, adaptable solutions. And Ukraine is actually leading in that space, because that's what they have to step into, and they've actually started to export that as well. So what do you think about that?
I mean, nuclear deterrence works, and that's why countries want nuclear weapons. That's why we see North Korea, Iran creating their nuclear arsenals, because they know that then the rest of the international community will leave them alone. So it does work. But imagine on the European continent, imagine Germany acquiring nuclear weapons. Think about recent politics in Germany. The AfD getting 30% of the vote, but now being declared extremist right-wing party, which might lose government funding. Can you imagine a party like that gaining control and being in possession of nuclear weapons. So you can imagine that nuclear proliferation on the European continent would be a rather destabilizing scenario, even though nuclear capabilities would be more affordable than investing in a lot of conventional weapons. But as Stefan pointed out, Europeans can be smart about it, that they can invest in equipment that doesn't necessarily mean these large standing armies that we had during the Cold War. We have all kinds of technological advances that we could make use of in lieu of nuclearizing Europe. Poland acquiring nuclear weapons. And just imagine what Russia would think about that and how destabilizing that would be. It would be a different scenario than what we've seen in Ukraine. I think so. I do not think, even though it's the cheaper, less costly version, that this is where Europe should go.
I mean, I want to make a point on the that was made about the drones and stuff, like looking at the conventional part. When I look, the way in which the war in Ukraine has often been described now is as an attrition war, akin to World War I. And of course, part of the reality of the war is exactly like that. But when I look at Ukraine's procurement choices, they are 100 times smarter than the ones we have. If I look at Ukrainian defense industry, for instance, I see on the one hand, Ukravatomprom, a large Soviet-style procurement agency, which has about the efficiency of the Soviet apparatus. But unfortunately, I'm afraid that our European and the American bureaucratic apparatus is much more like Ukravatomprom than like the other side of the Ukrainian equation, which is a whole bunch of startups, small, a lot of conscripts have been conscripted into the army. They end up being at the front. They end up thinking, how could we do this more intelligently? And they're the ones who are starting startups, small ones, some of them supported by the SBU, the Ukrainian intelligence service, which has had a much better track record actually on these issues than Ukravatomprom has. So I would like to much rather follow the example that we see in Ukraine, plus our smarts, right? Most drones in Ukraine are still first-person viewed. So there's actually a brave Ukrainian soldier somewhere in the trenches with a virtual reality thing on that's basically piloting those vehicles. If we would use some of the smarts that our AI companies are now using for a variety of other aspects in those drones, whereby they could be more autonomous and indeed smaller. They may not be the $2,000 ones that they initially bought from the Chinese. It'd be more like the $10,000 ones that the Ukrainians are now producing. But Europe could produce a whole lot of those. And I think the value proposition behind that, smart, unmanned, and it is we European armies are not, we don't want to fight like the Ukrainians are fighting now. This is indeed much more akin to World War I, to the insane slaughters that took place in World War I. We want to fight more intelligently, and we have the technology to do so, more so than the Ukrainians said at the beginning. They now may be ahead of us on many of these things, but so to me, that is the example. And what I see is the opposite. For instance, I live in the Netherlands, where the army, the land component, was very upset when they lost their tanks, and now their main ambition is to get the tanks back. When we get more money, we buy more F-35s. We want more frigates. We want more very expensive submarines, whereas the alternative investment opportunities are there. Now, we have fewer companies. In Silicon Valley, the whole mentality about working for defense is changing and has already changed. I think in Europe, we're seeing that too. We're seeing some small companies also stepping up, but they lose the battle for the money from the big procurement options, which are the traditional ones, the Cold War, the industrial age ones. We want post-industrial capabilities. And yes, part of it will have to be kinetic, things that go boom and that destroy things. But there's also lots of other opportunities that we may have to invest in other types of things. And those debates are not happening because, for instance, NATO is demanding a kinetic set of targets. Our industry still feels more comfortable with the money they make from the old, expensive and exquisite, and as it turns out, not nearly as exquisite as we thought them to be. So this debate is a debate that's not being had now. That is, voices that are pleading for alternative investment opportunities are almost being seen as traitors who basically are undermining the effort. That is, we are often told, you may be right, but right now is not the time. Right now, we've seen what happens in Ukraine, and so we need tanks, and we need jet fighters, and we need all these other things. And that, I think, is a part of the debate that I worry about. So I worry about poor value for money choices that are going to be made. because of the urgency, the speed, and also the mindset, the industrial age mindset that is once again capturing us, despite the fact that we see around us everything changing. The opportunities that artificial intelligence are giving us, not to make better weapon systems, but to do all sorts of other things, are incredible. And that is not what the discussion is about now. The discussion really is about, the combination of steel and firepower that was the industrial age. We Europeans invented that. The Industrial Revolution started in Europe, and it was the European armed forces who first started using these new physical tools to forge new capability bundles. Today, what we see happening around us is artificial intelligence enabling all sorts of other options. And yet we do not see the brave soldiers in that case in the 19th century who are starting to think, how can we achieve our goals? And our goals is not necessarily to beat Russia. Our goal is to create sustainable defense and security solutions in which people can prosper and thrive. That's ultimately why we do this stuff. So that's why I think the debate we're having right now is necessary. And I think a lot of it goes into the right direction, but I'm still very worried about, the opportunities that are being missed by still framing the challenge, the defense challenge, in an industrial age mindset, as opposed to a potentially post-industrial age one.
Our next question.
Thank you both for joining us. I have a question. Do you believe that AI will be an important discussion in the new NATO conference that's happening, particularly in physical and hybrid warfare? And have any NATO countries expressed concern over AI making mistakes?
It's a huge debate, of course, which again antedates a lot of the recent discussions. I wrote a book 10 years ago or so, which was called Artificial Intelligence for Defense and Security. And I made the argument that I just made, right? That you can use AI for so many different things and that we're using it in one particular corner and they should broaden that. So the debate is happening. It's activated because of all these recent trends that we've been talking about. So AI is being used increasingly in the kill loop, right? In getting better situational awareness and being able to read multiple sources and fuse them into a picture that can be used. It's being used in targeting. It's being used in optimizing payloads. It's being used in battle damage assessment. So it's really increasingly being used. And on the other side, there's a huge debate about killer drones, right? Is that really what we want? And frankly, we ask humans to do almost inhuman things in wars where they have to do it under incredible time pressure. Some of these guys and gals haven't slept for days, are in extremely risky situations and have to make decisions about whether to shoot or not to shoot. That is an incredible responsibility that we put on these people who, by the way, come back in droves with post-traumatic stress syndrome because of these kinds of issues. So I am certainly open to the debate about whether there are smarter ways of achieving our goals, which oftentimes may not even require the physical destruction that we now take for granted. There may be other ways of achieving those things. So I really think AI is already a big part of the debate, but I see it unfortunately being focused on the response side, not the prevention side. If you think for a second, what did we do wrong with Russia prior to February 24th of 2022 that led in the particular direction? What could we have done differently? I think we could have done a lot of things differently. And we also have to think about those things, not only about how do we prevent Russia from invading us or how do we repel them, but also those types of issues. So in the realm of prevention, there's a huge opportunity to use AI more intelligently for early warning, early detection of things. Think of the life sciences, right? They have mapped our body in ever increased levels of detail in a field that's called the omics in life science. So the past 20 years, we know a lot more about our body, which means we don't need chemotherapy anymore, which is our kinetic, bombarding our body afterwards. We can do much smarter things in detecting things early on, in genetically interfering with these things. There were also huge ethical debates about those, and they continue to happen. But to me, that is a great example. I would like to get away from chemotherapy to immunotherapy in defense and security. And right now, the debate about AI is primarily on the chemotherapy side and not on the immunotherapy side. I think that's a chance missed. And frankly, as a European, right, the role of defense industry in European decision-making, I already alluded to it, is much smaller. So I would think that we Europeans should be in a better position to try to forge new preventive and responsive capabilities. But unfortunately, this entire new discussion that's happening around Russia is hijacking that debate and is bringing it back to the industrial age thing that I talked about before.
We have time for one more question, Murat.
Thanks. Yeah, one question. You've been talking about Europe versus Russia, and right now you have a common threat. I think there's a superordinate goal that brings everyone together. But the reality is very different. I mean, the Slovak Prime Minister was attending the parade in Russia, and then you see what happened in Hungary and other places. And I mean, let's face it, France is one election away from Le Pen and her National Rally taking over and going in a completely different direction. We've heard the statements about their plans, you know, for the EU and for NATO. So I think the bigger threat maybe for the European Union is not well, Russia is, but I think the division within, you know, some countries, like I said, one election away from going the road. And how do you see those threats affecting the unity and the cohesion of Europe and the identity of Europe?
No, I think you're very right in pointing that out. I see it as a big threat as well. And I'm also afraid that the increase in defense spending are going, so the general population that votes for these, you know, whatever you want to call them, extreme right, populist, sovereignist, what, you know, there's various names. They're often the ones who have been hurting because they have been left out by globalization to a large extent. And the danger is that the current retreat to, you know, protectionism and the increased defense spending may make the very issues why those people vote the way they do even more urgent. And so we are already in a situation where the extreme right has, you know, 30% in many European countries. You know, Katja talked about the AfD in Germany, but Le Pen was really leading, and she may still win the next presidential elections, or not, maybe she herself or maybe her deputy. But you see that across Europe. So that is indeed a very important element, which we often underestimate. So I'm glad you pointed it out, because I do think the dynamics that are at work here, the geostrategic dynamics that are at work, may lead to an deterioration in the political sustainability of what we're trying to do. And that is a big challenge all the time. That's why I think the World Affairs Council and organizations like that are so important, right? In the United States, the official policy has always been much more interventionist than the American public wanted. The American public didn't want to. I mean, part of Trump's popularity is indeed that he says, why would we spend our money all over the world when we have so many problems here? So the gap between the population and the elite in the United States has been quite high, but the elite has been able, up until Trump, to sustain a certain level of activity in the world that went beyond what the American population probably felt. We're in a similar situation in Europe now, where we also have that, you know, the gap was very big. The layers that were opposed to all this money are coming back now. In the Netherlands here, right, we have an extreme right party, and two actually in parliament, in government. Now we have coalition governments, so they never get what they want. In the United States, winner gets it all, Trump gets to do whatever he wants. Here, the extreme right can win, but still has to compromise with other parties because we have a different political system. But the threat you allude to is very important and is often underestimated. And we, the elites, tend to voice everything in grand geostrategic terms, which frankly, to many voters are, you know, that they don't resonate. So there really is a big task of making sure that we keep addressing those issues, that we keep debating on these issues in various fora, like some very popular news programs now, which are frowned upon by intellectuals, are increasingly talking about these issues too. And they do try to infuse them also with some evidence and some things. So these things are happening, but they're a very important part of the agenda that we should not underestimate. If we're too far away from our societies, it's not going to be sustainable, and it's going to come back to bite us.
Katja, would you like to make some final comments?
I mean, Stefan basically said the political system you have is important. As long as you have coalition governments, you can oftentimes minimize the impact of these extremist parties. In the German case, right? I mean, the AfD won 30% of vote, some countries, but it's not, it's a member of the parliament because it's a democratic system, but it's not a member of the government. Right? No ministries were given to the extremists. And so it's about political systems and it's about institutions, right? Germany, in the aftermath of World War II, was tightly integrated, as I said, into the beginnings of the European Union. And within a member of NATO, you control political actors by hugely embedding them in institutional apparatus. And that allows you to then have some influence on them. Have these political spoilers like Orban, but they are members of the European Union, and therefore they're out who can counter their political trends. So I think that's what we need to look at, others to fight against those extremes.
Please join me in thanking our speakers.
Thank you.
We look forward to hosting you another time. Good luck.
Sounds great.
Take care. So we're going to break for lunch. Thank you so much for joining us for our second panel. And our last and lunchtime panel will be with the Consuls General of France, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Greece. We'll be having a conversation on a topic Murat actually just teed us up perfectly for about European identity. And the values and for the future going forward. So we'll see you back here at 11:30. And please help yourselves to lunch. 11:30.
Thank you. So.
You have chicken. Wonderful. Well, we hope that you've enjoyed your lunch. Please continue to eat as we get started with our final lunchtime panel of this wonderful symposium. Once again, can we give a round of applause to the Georgia State University staff and World Affairs Council of Atlanta staff and volunteers who are feeding us. This panel will build on the prior two. We've had very academic conversations about European energy policy and security, European defense, security, and now we want to talk about European identity and Europe's future. EU Day comes around every year, right? We've been celebrating it as Europe Day and then EU Day for decades. This year feels different for a lot of reasons, as we've heard this morning. It is our great honor to have 5 EU Consuls General with us today. Irish Consul General Frank Groom wanted to be here, but he's unfortunately back in Ireland. So we're here with us in spirit. But I would say the fact that these very busy and in-demand diplomats have made their schedules available for us today demonstrates the importance of talking about Europe and the European Union and the moment that we're in right now. And so this panel is entitled EU Day 2025, Europe's Vision for the Future, featuring European Consuls General discussing contemporary perspectives on European identity, values, and norms. Our conversation will explore what it means to be European today, considering the evolving cultural and political landscape. Our panelists will also address Europe's role and influence on the global stage, reflecting on the continent's contributions to international affairs and its vision for the future. Our discussion will provide a comprehensive overview of the changing dynamics within Europe and its aspirations forward. Please join me in welcoming, I will go from left to right, Anne-Laure Desjonquières, Consul General of France in Atlanta, Konstantinos Adamopoulos, Consul General of Greece in Atlanta, Melanie Moltmann, Consul General of Germany in Atlanta, Catherine Remekes, Consul General of Belgium in Atlanta, and Jacob Veerman, Consul General of the Netherlands in Atlanta. Thank you all for listening. So we built this as a conversation about European identity, values, and norms. So I will ask each of you to comment. How do you define European identity in today's context? We can start with Consul General here.
Yes, I think, well, thank you for having me, thank you for having us. For European identity, I think we have to go back like almost 3,000 years ago and start with the Greek philosophers
And for example, Saint Augustine, when they were defining the values of democracy. So from my perspective, from the Dutch perspective, when you look at the values, you have to look at a rule-based order. That's one of the basic, I think, principles of the European Union. You have to look at like a focus on supporting peace, democracy, human rights. And when you look at like what St. Augustine taught us, you have to look at faith, hope, and love. And I think these are the principles of Europe. These are the principles of democracy. I think these are also the principles of my country, and they are also the principles of the United States. Back to the Netherlands, when you look at the Netherlands in The Hague, we have the International Center for Peace and Justice, the home of the International Court of Justice, and the Permanent Court of Arbitration. So these values are very strongly felt at my Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also supported by the Dutch population. So, and that's our identity as the Netherlands, but it's also the identity we share with the 37 member states in the EU.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you, Rickey, for having us today. Good morning to you all. I'm afraid we're going to bore you a little bit with our answer to this question because I think I will just repeat what just said. But I think what the EU stands for, even when we look to its conception, what started out to be a very economic-driven project turned out into what the Europe stands for today. It's a value-driven organization. It's a peace organization. It's a peace project, of which for Europe is kind of extraordinary to be in peace for almost 100 years now, so it's never seen. And I think what within this peace project and what stands us apart is that it's diversity that makes her strength. I think Belgium is a good example. We have 3 communities, 3 languages. This only gets enlarged when we talk Europe, but still we manage through this diversity to create an additional strength and really put our stamp on the rest of the world. And I think this diversity, and at the same time being diverse but equal, being different but inclusive, and I think finding this balance between human rights, economic benefits, and prosperity for all is, I think, what drives the EU forward.
Good morning, and thank you, Rickey, for having us. Yeah, this gets more and more difficult. Yeah, what we've covered, we covered human rights. We've covered basically the reason why we exist as an EU is peace, to preserve peace on the continent. Unfortunately, not on the whole continent, but on large parts of the continent. It's the economy, its values, and I would also say, so my first answer would have been diversity in unity. So, and that we share different identities. So we share a common European identity, we share a national identity, but we also share a local or regional identity. This, for example, in Germany is quite strong, the region where you are from. And I guess that's equally important in other European states. And we even have meetings of different regions. So the different regions play a role, and it doesn't matter to which member state they belong. And I think this unity is a very important aspect. It's also a really practical approach that we have and that we have to have when we have to find solutions to problems or challenges, because we always have to compromise in everything. So we are diverse, but we have to be unified also to be strong as smaller countries. And so I think compromise plays an important role in our work in the EU.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Europe is the success story of the 20th century. if you read the history, our area was full of wars, full of problems. So the European Union was a project of peace. Then it enlarged in the Eastern Europe, created a huge, big single area where countries and people coordinate themselves and expand their economies and protect the human rights.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Ricky, for inviting us today. Today is a particular date. It's the 75th anniversary of the Schuman Declaration. And this serves as an illustration to the European Union project and the identity. I don't know if you mentioned it this morning, but you know that Robert Schuman was the French Minister for Foreign Affairs. So Schuman Declaration took place only 5 years after the end of the World War II. I read about the way that Robert Schuman decided to do his declaration. He actually barely mentioned it to his prime minister and to the French government at the time because it was such a bold step, just 5 years after the war, to propose to put in common coal and steel, which are the main resources to make war, with our hereditary enemy, Germany, in the idea of making war forever impossible. So this was extremely bold. It worked beautifully, and we European Union member states worked around this initial project step by step to build the wonderful tool that we have today. I don't want to repeat everything that my colleagues said, but you know that, as Jaap told us, European Union is deeply based in the rule of law because European Union member states have made the choice of renouncing part of their national sovereignty in order to accept the majority rule of the member states in the Union democratically. And so everything in the European Union is treaty-based. We have a very strong definition of our identity and of our core values in the Treaty of the European Union. Articles 2, Article 3 of the treaties remind us what those core values are. As my colleagues mentioned, freedom, democracy, human dignity, rule of law, and all European Union member states have to accept a common set of rules in order to be able to enter European Union. So we make this choice, and then we have to respect and enforce those values. And we also made the choice to accept, the jurisdiction of the Court of Union of the Court of Justice of the European Union, who's in charge of enforcing the fact that all those rules are respected. So we have this overarching institution that makes sure that every European Union countries respect all those norms and principles. This is a strong identity. The other identity, of course, is cultural, but my colleagues already commented a lot on that. We have this common set of rules, but we are extremely diverse. We have so many languages, and we also work towards maintaining this diversity. So working all together and accepting our diversity and differences.
Not unlike the American identity. We can be Southerners, we can be Georgians, we can be Americans at the same time. Many things can be true at once. But things are changing in Europe. Things have always been changing in Europe. They will always change in Europe. So how have cultural and political changes within Europe influenced European identity and also norms? And how do you balance tradition with modernity and change? Maybe we'll go the other way this time.
Well, European Union faces a lot of challenges today. I mean, all other countries do face them. We have, well, as my German colleague reminded us, war is back on the European continent. It has been back 3 years now. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is a huge security challenge for Europe. We have these threats of tariffs war that we want to avoid. We have energy challenges. We have the climate change challenge. So European Union, and we also have, I should add, a challenge on our democracies, because in many of our countries there are political challenges on our democratic models. So European Union has to constantly adapt and work together to face those challenges. Because I'm the Consul General of France and we all get to speak, maybe I would like to emphasize what French vision is for the future of European Union. We've been advocating for sovereign, protective and democratic European Union. By sovereignty, you know that France for a long time has been advocating for strategic autonomy and sovereignty, in particular in the field of defense. We can see that the current context is favorable in working towards a European Union that would be sovereign, that would have an autonomous defense system. And France has always emphasized that we need an autonomous defense, but that would be complementary to NATO and not in a competition with NATO, obviously. We strongly support the plan that was presented by the Commission to rearm Europe. We also advocate for to be sovereign and autonomous in energy. In particular, building our independence towards Russian gas. Well, we are also strong advocates for a sustainable development and energy transition towards clean means of energies. Well, I will stop there because others need to speak too.
I will add on this. I will say that the state of urgency that we created by the last year, the challenge that face the geopolitical and the energy sector, solidifies the political identity, political character of our union apart from economy. So, on the one hand, it was an unfortunate event to have this war in Europe, but on the other hand, it will enhance the European Union as a federation of independent states and to add more aspects,
I would like to comment really on that because we had now with this war in Ukraine, with the energy crisis, but also before with COVID, what we have seen is that crises also make Europe stronger and really show people of Europe and the governments that we have to work together. So I think, especially before COVID, as the first really external shock, I have a feeling that a lot of people, a lot of companies and governments, they took Europe for granted. And we were often like struggling or competing or discussing minor issues. But when we really faces some existential situation, we showed that we could work together. And we could see how important Europe is for all of us, how important also free borders are among our countries. So I think crises made Europe stronger. So yeah, this is the more like also political identity.
Yes, no new things from me on that. I think indeed what we've seen currently is that European identity has been reinforced. I think especially what was happening to the east, but also national crises have have strengthened the European idea. I think it's crucial because many of the young Europeans, they don't know the origin of the project. They haven't experienced the war. So this brings kind of all these ideas back to life and very visible and very tangible, which help construct. Obviously, there are many challenges. I'm more referred to several of them. Another one that comes to my mind is migration. We also have a migration issue in the EU, but we also need migration. And it's also that I think the role is strengthening these ideas between the new citizens of Europe and all those countries that joined the EU since 2003, 2008. We all joined on the same basis of rule of law, same values. And I think we've seen through the 75 years that the EU is now in existence, we are able to adapt. Depending on the challenges that we face, the EU is able to overcome them through a lot of internal discussion, but also through compromise. What started as European Union for coal and steel has transformed over the years to the European Union that we know today. And I think this has always been done in a reaction to major challenges that came up through the years and making us more united and stronger integrated. But this being said, I think even if we see national challenges rise, be it on the left or be it on the right, the European identity is actually never really put into question. Even when there have been discussions on Hungary, they still remain committed to the European Union.
I only can underline this. When I look at the Netherlands, public opinion was critical for when you go back just before Brexit, there were like ideas of, okay, the UK leaves the Netherlands next, but no. So the general opinion in the Netherlands, when you ask them about Europe, they're very positive. And there is, at this moment, we have a more right-wing government who was one party in this government very critical about Europe. I think the general opinion in the Netherlands also put a lot of pressure on this party to be more positive and more balanced about the Netherlands' position within the European Union. Don't forget that our common market within the European Union brought a lot of prosperity and wealth for the Netherlands. And I think through crises, that awareness became stronger and stronger.
Catherine, you mentioned immigration and migration, and obviously there are demographic shifts within Europe, particularly whether it be migration, but also declining birth rates. How will these types of shifts affect European policies and also society?
They have affected already our societies, and that's also what we see on the political field, and it changes, like Jan mentioned, there are shifts on our national government that are reflected. But I think, and this is what the EU has been doing, and we keep on doing, is many of those that came to the EU are also looking for this prosperity, but they're also there because of the values that the EU stands for. It's democracy, it's human rights, it's freedom of speech, it's freedom of being who you want to be. So they support these ideas. Obviously, there are a lot of challenges, cultural differences make it difficult for people to understand. But I think we need to be able to have faith in the EU. As mentioned by my colleagues, we already have 27 languages or not more. So we are used to making a compromise. This does not mean that anything is possible in the EU. So definitely there will be policies that will become more strict on certain policies that have been there in the past, but this is also to be able to live together in a comfortable way. But this is not stating that we will close Europe. I think there is this fine balance that Europe always tries to find in addressing the challenge and having the best solution for all.
Yeah, I would like to add that, yeah, migration, or the question of migration, has been a challenge for European countries for years. How do we how do we react to this flow of immigrants legally? How do we balance the interests of different member states? Of course, we also have different national interests, and the interests of a country that has an outer border, Schengen border, EU border, is different from another country in the middle of Europe. So, and there have been years really of discussion to align our asylum policies in Europe. And I think it was one of the most difficult things to achieve, that we modernize these rules, but that we are still trying and keeping on to modernize these rules to make migration still possible, that asylum still possible, because it's deeply rooted in our values that this has to be possible, but also make it reasonable and workable for the member states. But what we've also seen with democratic shifts is that we need a stronger qualified workforce. So we also need migration, and to balance this out, still being open to asylum seekers, actively seeking qualified people who would like to study or to work in the European Union, but also trying to regulate this in a way so that not everybody can come and stay. This has been a challenge, and this is ongoing. But I think at the moment, there have always been discussions among member states, and these discussions also really play a role then on the national level. We saw it in Germany now with the more conservative government being elected, and immigration was one of the key issues. But I think apart from headlines, we all know that this is a topic that we have to face in Europe together, because really this free movement of people and workforce is what's one of the key issues that we have in Europe that we want to preserve.
I should ask the Consul General for one of those border edge of the Schengen zone.
Exactly, it's a main challenge for our country, being a point of entry of this immigration. We face it, this problem as a whole, European Union. So we face multiple challenges. First is the aging population, then is the multiple points of crisis around Europe, the periphery of Europe, in North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, Central Asia. So there are many people who want to come to Europe, but we have to build a legal framework to adapt, to integrate, and to apply specific rules on that. It's a challenging situation. It's always in the battle debate, not only in Europe, but in the other countries, and it creates multiple issues on the political level, the political debate. But applying specific rules and sharing the burdens will find a way to integrate people in a rules-based way.
Would you like to answer before we move on to the?
Well, what I think we have to prevent is that, and that's a responsibility for politicians, but also for us, is that we are influenced by the populist outcries of, for example, far-right wing parties who are using the challenge of immigration for other purposes. Facts matter, and working together matters, and populist outcries are never can never work.
Well, my colleagues have already said the essential, so I don't have much to add. I mean, there are immigration challenges. There is a long-term challenge also with aging population and the declining population of European Union member states. Our president recently spoke about demographic rearmament, actually, because we know that in the long term, without immigration, the population in our countries will decrease. So we must address the short-term immigration challenges without losing sight of the long-term challenges as well. And we have a political context where addressing those challenges isn't that easy. Our populations have concerns that must be taken into account. And solidarity between member states is something that's extremely important. And I mean, we had several very acute crises where it's been a challenge to enforce this solidarity and make sure that every member state takes its part of the burden. It is also something that we must keep inside us.
I'd like to ask each of you to share the ways in which your respective countries have taken leadership roles in international affairs. What are some key achievements and initiatives, starting with France?
This is a very, very broad question. I'm sorry.
Give us some example.
Yes,
I've already
I'm not
brought
going to be able to give an exhaustive answer. I would say that, well, obviously war in Ukraine, I mentioned it before, it's obvious, it's a major security challenge. It's a security challenge for Europe. It's a security challenge for each of our countries. France has been targeted by Russian cyber attacks on an extremely regular basis since the beginning of the war. Well, as you know, France and the European Union have been extremely active in supporting the efforts of Ukraine to contain the aggressive war of Russia. Currently, well, we absolutely share the objective of attaining peace as quickly as possible, as long as it is a comprehensive and just and sustainable peace. To mention maybe more punctual diplomatic initiatives of France, I also mentioned our involvement in sustainable development. Well, you know that France is the country where the Paris Agreement was concluded. This has remained over the years as one of the main priorities for French and European diplomacy. That we do not lose sight of the urgency of this matter that can only be dealt with, with an international effort of every country. France is also holding the United Nations Conference on Oceans in Nice this year, and the objective is very ambitious, is actually to reach an agreement that would work for oceans the way that Paris Agreement worked on climate. So this is one of our main priorities for the year. You know that we also held a summit on artificial intelligence in February in Paris. Another global issue that we need to address in an international way, because no country can deal on its own with that kind of issue. So let me also stop there and let my colleagues speak.
So Greece, as you know, is a country that is a member of the European Union, but at the same time, it's a Balkan country of Southeast Mediterranean, very close to the North African Arab countries. So I try to promote peaceful settlements, both the Balkans and the Middle Eastern area. And in the recent years, we're trying with the green energy transition to be part of this ambitious project to promote energy security of Europe.
Yeah, I will add basically also to these main focuses that we now have. It's security, of course, but climate change is also a big issue, and environmental protection. But climate change also with the financing mechanism that comes with it. So how can we finance the adaptation mechanisms in poorer countries, rising sea levels, people like economies that won't work in the same way that they do now, how we can support smaller countries there. I think sustainable development and really working together with what everybody calls like the global south has become more important. And I think this is also one of the key issues that Europe has to face, because we don't want to leave the floor only to Russia and China and Africa, for example. just these are European goals, so we all share them when it comes to climate change, green transition. And I think Belgium there specifically focuses on a few sectors like the offshore wind, which for Belgium is kind of the initiatives that we support and everything linked. Also like Anwar said on blue and ocean preservation. When it comes then to the more security issues, I think we support many of those that have already been said, but I think specifically for Belgium, we were unfortunately at the scene of the brutal attacks in 2016 in Brussels airport, and obviously also the ISIS fighters. So definitely Belgium plays a big role in the fight against terrorism and also in the more recent fight against drug traffickers. Antwerp is one of the major ports in the world. So cocaine smuggle, now also fentanyl, we're not only in European coalitions, but also in global coalitions in the fight against drugs. And this also goes a little bit further when Antwerp being also the capital of the diamond sector, while Belgium is also actively engaged what is called Kimberley process, and it's kind of to trace diamonds to, like you mentioned, the financing of many things, many wars, is kind of to prevent them.
Yes, what can I add? Like the Netherlands, half of the Netherlands is below sea level. So climate change, sustainability, adaptation, water management, but also food security is a very important focus of the Netherlands. As you may know, the Netherlands is one of the world exporters in agriculture, horticulture products. And this was always linked to our also development cooperation goals, together, of course, with our European partners.
Thank you all for commenting. We're going to go to audience questions in just a moment, but I'll just turn our conversation toward the US, where we are. How do you view the current state of European-US relations? I'm not going to assume to know what your answers will be, so we'll allow you to answer. But more specifically, what are key areas of cooperation? The media wants to cover all sorts of tensions between Europe and the US, trade, tariffs, but what are the points of cooperation between the EU and the US?
Between the EU and the US, I think when I look at the Netherlands, we have, like my colleagues, a very strong transatlantic cooperation with the US dating already for 400 years. I'm an historian, so when you ask me about the current political situation, then my diplomatic answer is, okay, in 30 years, nobody will talk about this anymore. This is just like what history teaches and shows us. Our focus areas are water management, agriculture, horticulture, innovation, biotech, medtech, more or less all the fields of industries, port development. Rotterdam, as you know, one of the big international ports. Even last week, we had a delegation over on Schiphol Airport to discuss cooperation with Atlanta Airport on cooperation that is linked to logistics and supply chain. So there is more or less no sector you can mention we don't have, even here in the Southeast, we don't have any connection with your business. And also our political cooperation with the US is as strong as ever.
I always try to see a little bit more nuance because I'm now here in Atlanta. I don't know US that well, but I know that there is already a big difference between here and Miami or California. So and the same goes for the EU. I mean, it would not dare to compare Belgium to Greece, for instance. So I think obviously the newspaper headlines, they're kind of posing on two sides of the Atlantic, very much opposing. But I think our transatlantic relations have been strong and have been ongoing for decades. So they're a lot more intertwined and more collaborative than maybe recent headlines show. So I think definitely a lot of opportunities exist there. And I'm not just talking the trade, and yes, we have the tariffs currently, but I mean, there definitely, but there's always been contentious issues when it comes to trade. So that's not really new, and we generally are able to overcome them. I think there's also much that links us. Trade is also way bigger worldwide than just EU and US trade, but obviously it's a driver for economic development. And I think we should not lose sight that it's not just bilateral trades, but it's global trade that is impacted. And this also goes for other topics. For instance, we mentioned security quite a lot. Obviously, we have NATO, but EU and US have steps to by each other's side, not only when it came to World War now Ukraine, but also in other fields of theater, be it in Africa or elsewhere, be it against the fight against terrorism. So I think even there is a lot of cooperation that can still be built. I think we still share a lot of the same values, and I think it's just maybe find different ways on putting that into actions, but I think there's a lot more that unites us and that separates us even today. I would of course concur, and there's much more going on behind the scenes that we don't read in the newspapers. So there are working groups between the governments of our countries, with the United States, but also with the EU and the United States. And this just hasn't stopped, although there might be a more critical headline on trade or on political values or anything. So this is still ongoing. And I guess Europe and the United States, we are two regions, basically, two countries, two regions that really need each other. So not only as big trading partners, as investors, as security partners, but I think innovation is a really important topic also. We need innovation really to make progress in really developing our economies and our societies, and also in the fight of climate change. And I think Europe and the US, they are both really big drivers of innovation, of scientific cooperation. And I think this is an area that used to be very strong and is still very strong. So after these exchanges, these personal exchanges also on the scientific field, it has been a bit down after COVID, but I have the feeling that's in the upswing again, and it will remain important in the future.
I agree with my colleagues. The transatlantic relations political sphere is very strong, but due to the global shift of power, we have to enhance it. We have to promote more the political connection and relations between the United States and the European Union. There may be some discussions in the trade sector, but if we take into consideration the global shift of power and the many challenges that we face in Eurasia, we need to enhance more our transatlantic bonds.
Well, speaking that, my colleagues have said it all. So again, I will repeat, our relationships are so strong. Everything is intertwined. If I take France, for example, the US have been the major investor in France for years. I see no reason for that to change. We know that we would have a lot to lose if the situation were to change. So, and I mean, on a very wide range of issues, including on, you know, international challenges and crisis situation in many areas, we have a strong dialogue that is ongoing, and many initiatives that do not have the same focus in the media as some other issues can have. So I feel very confident, like my colleague, that our relationships will just continue to develop, adapt, and we all know that our interest is to work together.
What questions do we have from the audience? Oh no, are we without microphones again? Well, why don't you stand up so we can hear you? We'll start with you and then, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Ethan Trin, and I'm from Georgia State University. Thank you. Sure. So we've been talking about world affairs, right? And I think one of the important things that we have not discussed is education, because education is the core of a lot of issue, right? So when we talk about global, we have not forgot about the importance of local. The local and global is connected. So from the education perspective, like myself, I would like to ask you all, like, can you please give us an example of how, the Consul General, like, make the a bridge between, the consul and, the local education in Atlanta?
I think most of my colleagues do similar things when it comes to education. I think we all try to build strong partnership between local universities and our hometown universities. This can go on two levels. So either they can be institutionalized, like we have full agreements between universities, but generally most of them it's kind of a bottom-up approach where professors work together between different research institutions, like Melanie mentioned on the innovation, like it's joint innovation. But on the other side, there's also a lot of focus whereby we enhance student exchanges. I was just talking to people, we have US students visiting Belgium, we have Belgian students coming to the US, be it on Fulbright scholarships or other ways of scholarships. And then there's also a lot of us going to talk to universities and going to talk to students about what we stand for and kind of help promote this transatlantic relationship, also our European identity, also our national politics. So it's also this mutual outreach, be it at student, research, or political level.
If I may add, it's also the same goes also for schools on a different level. But we not only try to support German as a foreign language, for example, but for example, I also attend Model United Nations conference. So to talk about what does this mean to be an active member state of the UN, for example, why it is so important to work together in the international arena. We try to support schools when they would like to have a student exchange, or we bring scientists to projects with elementary or middle schools, for example, on specific science topics. So we try to make also younger students curious for other countries and curious for exchange. And I think this is really important to show them, oh, there's a world outside your local area, and you might have a look and might experience something very interesting.
From the Dutch consulate, we do the same thing. We support Dutch universities who want to set up or work together with local universities. Recently, we worked with Georgia Tech, for example, to bring students in contact with Dutch companies and to work with them on a challenge. And we brought the students to the Netherlands, to the companies to learn about the Dutch ecosystem. What we also started, and that's more local, is that we introduced Dutch companies, multinationals, to the technical colleges for workforce development, where the demand and supply was brought together, and where programs from technical colleges are developed to work with these Dutch companies.
Yes, we also support and encourage student exchange. We have a program called Study in Greece that encourages foreign students to go to Greece. And we also have many students of archaeology and history that they study their science in reality in the archaeological sites of the country.
Well, likewise, we have many exchange programs between research institutions, universities. We have a whole range of scholarships and grants to all levels, undergraduate, graduate, postdoc, to encourage students to study in France. We also have a Start in France program that encourages students with a deep tech or startup project to implement that project in France. And like Germany, we have programs to support the French language at all levels, French in higher education, but also in schools. We have programs to support dual immersion education, French heritage programs to encourage students with a French background or French speaking background to continue to learn their mother tongue. So yes, all range of program, and I must say it's one of our big priority locally and in the whole US to work with students and encourage the interest for France and also the interest for our language.
If I might add, there are also European programs. So European mobility of students and exchange of researchers, for example, there have been programs for a long time. But there's also an Erasmus Plus program where third country universities, like in the US, can work with 2 or more European universities on a joint program. So this is something where you can really get not only bilateral, but really the European experience as university or scholar.
We have time for one more question. Was there one over here? Sure.
Okay, great. Sorry.
It's coming.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Nandita. I go to the University of Georgia, and I was someone mentioned before, and I think it was also mentioned in the panel as well, there's been a rise of, far-right ideology and also maybe a bit of mis and disinformation, especially during election time. You said facts. So I was just wondering how each of your countries, or I guess how you guys, what your general recommendations were in order to help stop the spread of this misinformation from these far-right parties, because that does cause a lot of fracturing within countries and then also within the European Union as well.
I would start, I think education is key. So it's really like education and literacy, internet literacy for the younger generation. So how to teach them how to navigate the internet, how to navigate social media. This is key. And there's a European task force really working against disinformation that has come, for example, from Russia, not only cyber attacks, but huge disinformation campaigns. We see them in Germany every day. So for example, also the German ministry has a special division that really deals with these disinformation campaigns. And the European Union has the same, and I guess the other member states do this as well.
I would add that we have a regulation at the European level to help fight misinformation. You know that freedom of speech in the European Union is more regulated than it is in the US. One of the purposes is being able to stop hate speech, to stop misinformation, and to be able to react on a disinformation campaign.
I also agree with that. It's a part of hybrid warfare, this information and misinformation. And it's a technical expertise. If you develop a special technical structure, to protect our societies by this way of waging war.
maybe just to compliment, I think it's also, you're all students, and I think Melanie mentioned education is crucial, but I think it's also encouraging critical thinking. It's not because you've seen something or you read something, even if it's in a newspaper, that it needs to be true. It's just kind of install a critical thinking reflex among citizens, among students, to question. There's nothing wrong with questioning sources of information whatsoever. And I think in that also comes the quality of the medium and the freedom of medium, whereby we strongly advocate and have a lot of projects for freedom, independence, and investigative journalism as a key element in this critical thinking.
There is not so much I can add, except that I'm always surprised that misinformation and lies are more accepted now than science and facts. And I think education and communication, and also bottom up and top down cooperation from government perspective, but also from the general public and students and all of us. That's where we have to fight this, I think, disease.
Please join me in thanking our panelists. I know that our Consuls General will stick around if any of you have any questions. Maybe you're from the countries that they represent. You can say hello and introduce yourselves. We believe very strongly in feedback, and so you all will receive an email with a survey, and we would love to hear your feedback on today's program. If we get really high marks, we'll do it again, but please help us improve. Please also subscribe to our newsletter. If you're not already a subscriber, you can find out more about us at wacatlanta.org, wacatlanta.org, and we'll be announcing upcoming opportunities. I'd like to give a special mention of a brand new program that we have at the World Affairs Council in Atlanta called the Global Leadership Fellows. This is Atlanta's first ever cross-sector early career global leadership development program. You're all familiar with the leadership development programs that exist in Atlanta. This is the first one that's truly internationally focused. It's a series of master classes in big forces that shape the world. We'll be going to the Federal Reserve Bank later this month to talk about governance and policy. Part of it is an international immersion. We just got back from a week in Germany. We traveled all over the country of Germany, largely to introduce them to excellent public transportation. That's one of our it's really, truly, it's an exceptional experience, and applications just closed for our next cohort, but please subscribe to our newsletter, and just please know that this exists for yourselves or for your children or for people in your workplace. It's something that we think is important so that the World Affairs Council of Atlanta can continue to bring you all important programs like this one. We've been around for 15 years and we want to be around for 15 more. And we can do that with support from the community like you all. So thank you for giving us the first half of your Friday. We will release you to your weekend. Please stay and have some more lunch and refreshments, get to know one another. And we look forward to seeing you very soon at a future event. Thank you very much.